The bipolar express. I wasn't the best behaved child a parent could hope for. I was selfish, greedy, and hostile. Basic nightmare kid. I'd pitch fits when I didn't get my way, and often make sure to break something my folks treasured to make my point. I would pound on walls, throw things across the room, and even slap or hit my mother or father when they would feebly attempt to calm me down. My dad had apparently been abused by his father when he was a kid, so he would always try his best to keep his cool when I raged on. I took advantage of that fact and made sure to push every single button I could to practically dare him to hit me. Many times, he would just walk away and leave me screaming and raging, but I considered that a win. Oh yes, I was far more than a handful, but my parents still loved me, even if I was a monster in the making. It wasn't until that Christmas Eve of 2001 that I learned I was not the center of the universe, a lesson I most definitely needed to learn. It was during the family gathering on that day before Christmas that I pitched a legendary fit upon learning the supposed truth about the reality of Santa Claus. I was only 10 years old, and were it not for the kind hearts of my folks, I would have spent every single one of those years on the naughty list. That late November threatened to turn even those who still cared for me off the deep end. Everyone had arrived at our house for the festive meal, and my cousin Courtney had been pushing my buttons all day. She was a good 3 years older than me, and thought she knew everything that the world had to offer. Being far more experienced and knowledgeable than I, she assured me there was no such person as Father Christmas, a truth I was not ready to hear. She kept pushing and pushing as the day progressed, and I finally just lost it. We were up on the second floor of my childhood home, where my bedroom was located. Over the course of my raging tantrum, I pushed her out of my safe space with every ounce of strength my little arms could muster. Even after I got her out of my door, I continued thrusting my palms into her back, paying no attention to what lay ahead. She had already started crying before I gave that final jab that sent her rolling down the stairs. She tumbled against the wall and the railing as her arms flailed and head bounced from one step to the next. The snapping sounds and muffled yelps ended with a thud when she hit the floor below. Every adult had made it out there before her fall came to a close, and their shocked and appalled eyes cut from her twisted body to my guilty face. I had performed some awful acts during my short lifespan before that day, but my parents had always attempted to cure my terrible ways with kindness. This would mark the end of such times. Before the ambulance arrived, my father snatched me by the ear and dragged me into my bedroom. He screamed at me in a way I did not realize he was capable of. I was crying my eyes out while begging for forgiveness, but he wouldn't let up. He wanted me to cry, and he was right. I deserved this and worse. As his anger grew more intense with every word, until he raised a hand up to strike me, it wasn't until then that his own rage faltered. He just stared at his own hand for a moment, before he dropped it exhaustedly back to his side. He glared back at me, and I watched the scowl on his face lighten back to a more blank expression, with tears slowly dripping from his eyes. He shook his head from side to side, and turned to leave the room without so much as looking back at me before he slammed the door shut. I would not see him again for the remainder of the day. The house fell silent after the paramedics left, with Courtney strapped to a gurney. I watched out my window to see everyone, including my parents, leave the house to follow the ambulance to the hospital. I was never left alone at home, but clearly nobody could stand to be around me at that moment. Truth be told, I didn't much care to be around myself at the time. The hours dragged by while I sat alone in my bedroom, surrounded by all of the toys and video games my behavior had never earned me. Regardless of my short life having included an almost endless supply of tantrums and violent mood swings when I didn't get my way, I never really felt bad about the misery I wrought. I generally only cared that I got what I wanted by the time I was done. This time, however, I did not feel any level of joy from this. I tried to defend myself in the back of my mind, reasoning that it was completely the fault of my older cousin for pushing my buttons, but I knew she didn't deserve this. Perhaps if she hadn't gotten in my face, I wouldn't have snapped like I had, but her actions did not warrant what I did. Maybe she just ended up with a couple of bruises, and it's not as bad as it sounded, I reasoned with myself, though I could still hear the snapping of her bones ringing in the background of my silent, darkened room. No matter how hard I worked to evade the guilt that was in pursuit, I could not escape it. I can't say I had ever felt like this before. Even when I broke the big screen television my father took such pride in, I didn't feel bad, regardless of my inadvertently setting fire to the curtains in the living room, which very possibly could have burnt the entire house down if my mother's reflexes hadn't been so quick. My conscience still felt clear. There was no getting away from this one, no matter how much inner arguing I performed. Courtney could be dead for all I knew, and her blood would be on my hands. For hours I just sat there in silence, perched on the floor of my room. Even after the sun retreated for the night, I did not move from that same spot. I could have gotten to my feet to at least turn a light on, but I wanted to be in the dark. Any light could run the risk of me seeing my reflection in the window, or something. I couldn't look into my own eyes right now. While my brooding continued and the world outside fell still, I became aware of a slight rumbling. It felt as though the whole house had begun to tremble slightly. The sensation was growing more and more intense by the second, finally inspiring me to break myself free from the carpeted floor for the first time in hours. I ran to my window to look outside after light appeared to beam through, almost as if the sun had shot back up from its dormant state. I could barely believe what I saw while I pressed my nose to the glass. My childhood home was on a very average suburban street. Most of the houses sported similar designs, with not much variation in color palettes. A 2-lane road with houses on either side of it, just like millions of other neighborhoods across the country. Said road had now been replaced by a train track, with a long and somewhat ancient-looking steam train parked upon it. The smoke billowed from the wide chimney on the front, lining the street in an almost unnatural fog. As I stared in at this unusual sight, I saw a man in a conductor uniform exiting the train. As soon as he set foot on the snowy ground, he glanced up to meet my gaze. I quickly ducked down beneath the window, but I could still feel the eyes on me. I lifted my head up to look down at the man once more, to find he was still glaring at me. He had a kind face, with a wide smile and bright eyes. He raised his hand and gestured for me to come to him. Though I was more than a little freaked out, something inside me was almost begging to march out into the cold to see this up close and personal. I grabbed my thickest winter coat, scarf, and boots, and ran down the stairs without looking back. I threw the front door to my home wide open, and I just stood there staring out. I pulled the knit cap from my coat pocket and pulled it snugly onto my head, while the conductor still smiled on, waving his arm to beckon me forward. I stepped out into the thick snow on the ground, while swinging the door shut behind me. The wide-eyed and grinning expression of the man did not falter while I took wide steps, crushing the snow beneath my boot. "Are you ready, lad?" the man asked in a deep voice and very proper-sounding English accent. "Ready for what?" I asked, craning my neck to look into the man's eyes. He was much taller up close than I had expected when I watched him from my second-floor window. He appeared to be straining a little while bending his head down to look back at me. "To go to the North Pole, of course," he replied. "You're not serious," I scoffed. "Do you doubt your own eyes, child?" he asked, holding his arms out as if to present the train to me, like I hadn't noticed it. The man's expression had still not wavered, even a little. His bright green eyes were so wide that they almost appeared to not be cupped on top and bottom with any eyelids, just perfectly round circles with small pupils in the center. His perfectly aligned and sparkling white teeth looked almost false and slightly cartoony. Though the face as a whole seemed unthreatening, I became more and more uncomfortable the longer I stared up at it. "No," I replied, shaking my head softly. "I don't think I should." He just glared down at me with those cue balls for eyes and chiclet teeth, neither blinking nor moving in the slightest. I felt my back tense up, and I was unsure if it was due to the frigid cold or the gaze of the stranger in the dark red train conductor's uniform. I started to back away from the man, whose brow had begun to sink a little, forming a crease above the large and somehow darkening eyes. They had been a light green before, but as I stepped away from him, they appeared to have grown a much deeper shade, bordering on black. "I think I'm going to go back inside now," I said as I continued to back away. We continued our staring contest as I waved my hands around behind my back, hoping to feel my front door approaching soon. The second I felt my fingertips make contact with the reflective brass doorknob, the conductor outstretched his own arm in front of him, still maintaining his unsettling gaze. As I turned the knob, the white-gloved hand shot towards me, growing as it drew closer, until the elongated fingers wrapped themselves around my entire torso. The grip was so tight, it almost squeezed the breath right out of my lungs, before it rapidly yanked me back to the man. Before I knew it, he was holding me right in front of his face. His unblinking eyes appeared almost the size of my head while he examined my face. "You will be boarding this train, young man." His foul breath hit me like a truck, causing me to cough and gag at the stench. "Would you care to climb the steps of your own volition, or shall I carry you like this?" His eyes looked as though they were pulsing while they glared into mine. The horrendous odor that spilled from his mouth still lingered in my nostrils, but that wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as his stare. I'll walk," I stuttered, in little more than a whisper. The man nodded his head as he gently placed me back onto the ground. My shaky legs threatened to drop me to the concrete, and I briefly considered attempting to flee again. Somehow, I knew there would be little point in that. I would be boarding this train whether I liked it or not. The choice was no longer in my hands, if it had ever been in the first place. The lanky conductor lowered his body into a bow, while he gestured towards the open door that stood just above the 4 metal steps. My whole body was trembling while I approached, and then climbed up into the cab. There was an aged and musty smell that spilled from inside as I crossed through the precipice, with the tall, slender man pulling himself up behind me. "Take any open seat you like," he said, as we paced through into the passenger car. I glanced across the carriage to see only a handful of other children perched upon the seats of the elegant, yet somewhat eerie room. They all turned to look at me when I entered, and they all wore the same exhausted and timidly fearful expressions. There was a short-haired blonde kid with large, circular lensed glasses, wearing striped pajamas and a dark green robe. He appeared to be around 12 or so, if I had to guess. An African-American girl with long, braided pigtails, who looked to be about the same age as I, dressed in a unicorn nightgown and a thick white coat with a fur-lined collar. A little red-haired girl in a puffy pink coat sat next to a ginger boy who looked maybe a year or 2 older than her. I presumed them to be siblings. He wore a long, hooded blue coat and appeared to be bordering on tears, while he glared back at me. The cabin itself was quite large, far bigger on the inside than I would have thought when I looked on from my bedroom window. The ceiling was maybe 15 feet high, with 3 golden and ornate chandeliers hanging from it. They each held several flickering candles, though they provided little light to the darkly lit cabin. Shimmering, yet slightly tattered tinsel drooped from them in no particular pattern or design. Each red velvet-lined row of seats had a large, arched window to the side, with delicate filigree borders. The carpeted floor was the same color as the chairs, but it was lined in yellows and greens, while speckled with a variety of muddy stains. Still, as classy as the place looked, there was something about it that felt ancient and ghostly. This seemed a place in which the dead would gather to travel from one plane to the next, not one that would carry small and terrified children to the wonders of Santa's workshop. As my trembling legs led me to the closest seat, I had little doubt that we were not bound for any place fantastical and inspiring. Given the fact I had very possibly killed my older cousin, this journey was not to reward me. The sour expressions etched onto the faces of my traveling companions led me to believe we were all on the same page. We would be facing punishment for our ill deeds this night, something I could not deny that I deserved. We all sat in silence while the tall, thin man made his way to the front of the cabin before sliding the door open and leaving our sight. Occasionally one kid would glance at another before cutting their eyes back to the world that was now swiftly moving beside us. The train made little noise as it traversed the tracks that seemed invisible to the occasional bystander or driver behind the wheel of one car or another. It felt like we would just pass right through any obstacle that may drift in front of the speeding rail car, as though we existed now in a separate plane of existence. I briefly considered the notion that I had died and was now being transported to whatever realm awaited me in the afterlife. But it was more of a fleeting thought, mixed with a grain of denial. As I stared out the window to see the row of houses give way to a snowy and empty expanse, I became aware of the sweat that had begun to drip from my brow. I realized it was almost suffocatingly hot in here, and I thought it may be best to remove my thick winter coat. As I leaned forward to slide the padded fabric down my shoulders, the cute little pigtailed girl across from me cleared her throat loudly to catch my attention. She shook her head violently, whispering, "Don't." "Why not?" I asked. "It's so hot in here." "Shh," one of the gingers echoed from up front. "What the hell?" I asked, darting my eyes between the other occupants of the train car. "Shh," came from all directions now, and the girl across from me still shook her head wildly as I continued to pull off my coat. "You guys are being dumb," I said, shaking my own head, pulling my left arm free from my jacket. Suddenly, the door at the front slid to the side, revealing the still smiling face of the conductor behind it. Instantly, all of the other children turned their gaze away from me to look down at their own laps or out of their windows. I sat in place, with my right arm still in my coat, staring at the tall man as he strolled in wide strides towards me. He stopped when he got next to the seat I sat in, before turning to face me with his head tilted to one side. We just stared at each other for a moment, before he said, "Here, we only have one rule." I felt my heart begin to race while the wide, round eyes darkened once more. Never, ever let them cool. I slowly pulled my coat back up my left arm and pulled it shut in front of me. As I continued my staring contest with the grinning man, he held his right hand up beside his face, snapping his fingers. Seconds later, another man came speeding through the door, pushing a cart which held a tall pitcher and a single filthy mug. It took me a second to notice that the one who pushed the tray appeared to have absolutely no features upon his face. It was like a blank sheet of flesh with two small holes for eyes. No mouth, no nose or ears. The stained green and white striped shirt he wore hung to his knees, with eerily thin, pale legs protruding from beneath. I only refer to him as, well, him, because the proportions and mannerisms were somewhat masculine. Otherwise, there was little way of telling what he actually was. The blank-faced man stopped with the cart right beside the conductor, who reached for the pitcher with his eyes still fixed on me. He poured dark and steaming liquid into the cup without spilling a single drop, despite his gaze not shifting from mine. He laid the pitcher down and snatched up the cup, holding it out towards me. I reached up with my trembling hand and grabbed the mug, expecting it to burn my fingers, but it surprisingly didn't even feel warm. "Drink." I raised the cup to my mouth, and instantly recoiled when the steam billowing from the fluid within felt as though it would burn my upper lip. "It's too hot," I whined, lowering the cup back down. "One rule." But I tensed up from head to toe while tears began to stream down my face. There was no way I could pour this scalding drink into my mouth. I knew it would burn me from the inside out. The slender arms reached out to me again, one wrapping its thin fingers around the hand which held the mug, and the other clutching onto the top of my head. He forced the cup up to my mouth while pulling my head backwards. Never. The rim hit my lower lip, immediately and excruciatingly fusing the tender skin with the ceramic. Ever. The thumb of the hand which gripped my head tightly extended and lowered to push my bottom jaw open. Let them. I was struggling to break free from his grasp, and though he only held me by the head and hand, I could barely move my body. "Cool." He tipped the bubbling beverage into my open mouth, spilling the burning liquid across the skin of my face, as much as down my throat. I screamed out, horrified by the immense pain I had never before imagined. I felt blisters form on the outside of my mouth, as well as the inside of my gaping orifice. It was like fire was erupting from within me, as though it were melting my insides, tearing holes in the inner lining of my esophagus and stomach. My flesh bubbled and popped, while my guts churned against the unbearable suffering. As the final drops fell from the cup into my gullet, I felt the dark fluid begin to leak from holes it had formed in my neck and torso. I was only vaguely aware of the hand as it let go of my head and hand, while I coughed up thick blood onto my coat. As the conductor gingerly placed the mug back onto the rolling trolley, after tearing it away from the lip which had bonded to it, he ushered the blank-faced man out of the room. My body was spasming and twitching, while the holes in my flesh sealed themselves back shut. The bubbling skin on my face became still and soft once more, and the horrendous agony subsided. I turned to face the tall man again, to see him studying me, tilting his head from side to side like a curious dog. I just stared back at him, still trembling from the shock of the events that had just transpired. He turned on the spot, before walking back to the front of the cabin and out the door, sliding it shut behind him. Though my wounds had all closed, and my flesh showed no signs of the torment it had just suffered, my clothes were still damp from the liquid which had poured inside and through me. I had never felt more pain than the occasional scraped knee or elbow before this day. Perhaps some bruises from a fall from my clumsy twin left feet from time to time, but nothing even close to what I had just experienced. I was still shaking all over, and none of the other kids would even acknowledge me. They had tried to warn me. I couldn't deny that. Had they already experienced this themselves? I wondered. How long had the others been on board this train before I arrived? Would any of us ever escape this wretched thing? My head was in chaos as I turned to face the window again, to watch the world beyond these walls travel rapidly away as we thundered forwards. There had to be a way out, even if it meant leaping from the train and onto the snowy ground outside. Perhaps it would be thick enough to break my fall. I'm sure I wouldn't make it unscathed, but what hell awaited us if we reached our destination? I had to try to communicate with my cellmates, so to speak. I can't say that I was in a rush to break any more rules, but according to the conductor, they only had the one. Snow-covered fields were all that surrounded the speeding train, as I gazed through the glass, which was heavily frosted on the outside. My body was still trembling, though it was still insufferably hot in the train car I shared with the other silent children. Every now and then, I could swear I saw movement within the white mounds of earth outside. Though it was dark outside, the full moon shone down through a cloudless sky, which may have just been causing me to see things as we sped past the landscape on the other side of the window. Regardless of how peaceful, yet strangely unsettling my surroundings appeared, I was terrified of what awaited us, when the train reached its destination. With the torment I had already endured, surely what was still to come would be far worse. I felt my eyes welling up again as the hopelessness of it all struck me like a hammer to the jaw. I bowed my head, whispering prayers under my breath to make it through this in one piece. I had been an awful and conniving little brat my whole life, all 10 years of it. Perhaps I had no right to ask for forgiveness. With the awful things I had done only hours before, I found myself on this journey to hell. "Hey," I heard a whispered voice call from my left. I turned to see the little girl across the aisle smiling at me. "Hi," I replied softly. I meant to speak a little louder, but it seemed I was no longer capable of anything more than a whisper. Maybe I had sustained some lasting damage after all. She smiled at me, with something remorseful in her eyes. It was as if she felt guilty for what I had just endured, but even as much of a shitty human being as I was, I knew she tried to help me. I was just too damn pig-headed to listen. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." She cut her stare away from me as she spoke with a slight crack in her voice. "It's not your fault," I said, attempting to smile as much as I was able. We just stared at each other for a moment. She was a pretty girl with beautiful, big brown eyes. She looked very tired, though I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion from this experience or just the fact that it was sometime after midnight by this point. I was still very young and hadn't really taken the time to appreciate the opposite sex just yet, but I found myself quite taken with her, which caused my face to flush and cut my eyes away from her in embarrassment. "I'm Sophie," she whispered. I couldn't tell if she was keeping her voice low in hopes of avoiding alerting our host, or if she may have been forced to ingest the acid-like concoction herself. "Mikey," I replied, still feeling incredibly shy. "Will you shut the hell up?" The boy in the round glasses called out in an aggravated whisper. "You're going to get us all in trouble if you don't stop." His neck was craned around the edge of his seat to look at me, and his brow formed a scowl not unlike the one my father had shown me earlier that day. It mildly annoyed me that he was seemingly only directing his rage at me when I was not alone in the conversation I was having, but I could still understand where he was coming from. God knows what the other members of this small group had gone through before I boarded. I just nodded at the angry kid before giving Sophie a guilty smile and a shrug. The boy turned back to face away from me again, while I still gazed at the little girl on the seat beside mine. We locked eyes for a few moments, and I was surprised the experience didn't make me feel more uncomfortable. There was something peaceful about her, which helped my scattered mind regain a more composed state. That was, however, before the door slid open again. "Tickets, please," the conductor said as he strolled up to the red-haired kids up front. I don't have a tea ticket, sir," the boy replied, stammering to get the words out. "I beg to differ, young man," the tall man said as he snatched the right hand of the child up. The boy yelped when the man whipped a large ticket puncher out of his pocket. In one quick motion, he slid the kid's hand into the device and punched a hole right through the center of his palm. He cried out in pain as blood spurted from the wound onto his shirt, and tears spilled down his face. The little girl beside him tried to struggle against the slender man in the dark red suit when he wrapped his long fingers around her wrist, but he was far stronger than she was. As much as she fought to pull her hand away from him, he still managed to poke a fresh hole into her flesh, just as he had her brother. "Ticket, please." Still reeling from the burning liquid being forced down my gullet, I knew it would be a terrible idea to refuse the man's demands, so I offered my trembling hand, while biting down and preparing for what was to come. If nothing else, it was quick. Truth be told, the pain wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. I still screamed out, but it wasn't from the pain as much as the sound of the metal prong chewing through my tissue. I can't say I had ever seen that much blood pour out of me before, though. Sure, the holes which had only recently formed in my throat and gut mixed scarlet streams with the brown liquid as it oozed out from within me. But this was just thick, dark crimson that leaked from me now. It didn't stop flowing as quickly as my previous injuries either. The conductor still glared at me while I cupped my gushing right hand in my left. He almost appeared disappointed that I wasn't making as much of a fuss as the other kids, who still whined and sobbed. I turned my gaze to meet the little girl across the aisle, trying to mentally signify to her that it wasn't all that bad. Strangely, she showed no signs of fear or apprehension. She just smiled back at me with something in her eyes I couldn't quite decipher. "What are you looking at, child?" the grinning man asked, before I cut my eyes back to meet his. "Huh?" I replied, quite confused by the question, as I found it quite obvious who I was looking at. "What are you looking at?" There was an impatience to his voice, regardless of the fact that he spoke almost mockingly slowly. "What?" Before I could finish my single-word reply, he swatted the back of his hand at the side of my face. This hurt considerably more than the hole in my hand, though I could not tell if my spinning head was due to the impact or the blood loss, as my palm still oozed onto my pants. "The girl," I replied with tears streaming down my swelling face. For the first time, I watched the wide smile falter. The conductor's expression appeared to melt into an almost human form before he turned slowly to face the girl sitting across from me. He stood staring at her for what felt like minutes, before he quickly turned on the spot and sped back through the door at the front of the cabin. When the door slammed shut, I looked back over at the cute little girl, who quickly cut her eyes away from me. "What just happened?" I asked, truly mind-boggled over the fact that the man appeared to not even know she was there. "That's, complicated," she replied with a shrug. "How come?" Nothing had made any sort of sense since this whole nightmare began, but this was something I could not even begin to wrap my head around. "Well," she said, still refusing to allow our eyes to meet. "The thing is," she was cut off by the door sliding open, with the conductor practically sprinting through it towards us. I pressed my back against the window, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen, while the little girl jumped out of her seat and into the aisle. She just glared at the man with her hands balled into fists as he charged at her. His movements were fast, so much faster than my eyes could even register. In an instant, he tackled the girl, rolled into the floor, and back up onto his feet, with his arms wrapped around her. She was struggling against him, but he held her far too tightly as he headed out the door behind where I sat, slamming it closed behind him. We all stared at the sealed door with our collective mouths hanging slack and wide. The kids at the front of the car were murmuring back and forth, clearly attempting to puzzle together what had just transpired. Before I was even aware of what I was doing, I took off towards the back door. As I pulled it open and headed through, I heard the other kids yelling at me to come back, but I felt suddenly filled with more purpose than I ever knew myself to be capable. I charged through the door of the next train car, then the following one, still finding no trace of the two who had passed through. All three cars that were behind the one I had fled from showed no evidence that they had ever been occupied. While I stared off the back of the train, taking in the vast, empty landscape in our wake, I knew what I had to do. Clearly, they had not fled backwards, leaving only one logical direction. As he had not carried her back through the doorway he entered, I had to deduce they had gone up to the roof of the train. I sprinted back through the cars until I reached the doorway to the one I had left. Though my hands still violently trembled, I reached for the ladder which led to the roof with my still bleeding hand. I had no idea what I would do if I caught up to the conductor, but I had to at least attempt to save the little girl from whatever he had planned for her. I had never put anyone's needs before my own my entire life. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I had done to my cousin that drove me to attempt a likely ill-fated rescue. I knew I would likely not survive this, but there was something about that girl. I had to save her, no matter the cost. The strong wind was freezing when I reached the snow-covered roof, which honestly felt quite remarkable at first, given the stifling heat inside. Still, it didn't take long for the cold to feel as though it was biting right through me. The chill aggravated my still leaking hand, though the blood flow had slowed considerably. As I paced on, I found it difficult to even hold myself upright, let alone push my body onward, but I knew I had to. The first several steps required far more effort than I had hoped, leaving me unsure if I would even be capable of completing my self-appointed mission. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I had done to my cousin that inspired me to continue to force one foot in front of the other, but I dreaded to think what the cute little pigtailed girl was enduring while I trudged through the thick snow. Once I got into a rhythm, I managed to quicken my pace, but only slightly. Pushing against the strong and icy wind, combined with the high strides I was having to take to break each step free from the snow, made swift progress out of the question, but it was progress nonetheless. I could barely see 4 feet in front of me, let alone whatever distance I would have to traverse before reaching a battle I was sure to lose. But I wouldn't let that stop me. I plundered on with purpose, and with every single successful step I was more and more driven by that. I had no way of telling how much time had passed by as I leapt from train car to train car. The first jump was the hardest, and the most terrifying, but not unlike those initial hesitant footfalls, every leap was less scary than the last. By the time I saw a faint light ahead of me, I had successfully cleared 6 boxcars. As I drew closer to the light, I could see it flickered like fire, though it appeared to float several feet above the roof. "You should not be up here, little boy." A voice even deeper than that of the conductor spoke. I felt my bladder attempt to give way as the shimmering light moved closer to me, revealing what appeared to be an incredibly tall person with an ancient-looking fire lantern for a head. It wore a long, brown, snow-speckled coat, which came down to feet that were buried in the snow. Its long arms hung just past, where I presumed its knees to be as it stared down at me. Well, as much as a lamp can stare, I suppose. Still, I could feel it glaring at me, causing that same discomfort the conductor's wide eyes gaze caused. I have to get by," I said, doing my best impersonation of someone with actual confidence in their words. Without another word, its long arms reached towards me. I ducked down and rolled through the snow, managing to avoid its grasp, but this did not get me any closer to my goal. It swiped at me with the right arm, following with another swing from its left. Fortunately, the thing did not move quickly, and I found myself able to dodge. It just continued to swat at me, while I tumbled and leapt around the elongated limbs, while attempting to locate any way of getting past. Finally, I noticed a split in the long coat, where the buttons ended just above the presumed knees. As both arms reached out for me again, I jumped forwards into the open section of the trench coat. The legs I now crouched between looked thin and frail, so before the bony hands, which were attempting to reach me through the opening, could grab me, I kicked at the left foot which stood in the thick snow to my right. Even with my small and weak stature, it didn't take much force to cause the tall creature to stumble. As the leg I kicked slid to the side of the roof of the train, the other came crashing down on me. Before it could pummel me to the ground, I rolled out through the curtain-like back of the long coat. Once I was clear, I turned around to see arms and legs flailing as the lamp-headed thing stumbled off the speeding train. I saw nothing more than a quick flash of light, followed by a thin line of smoke rising from where I assume it made contact onto the ground. With my heart still hammering, I stood up on my trembling legs and started back on the path in the hopes of tracking my quarry before whatever the conductor had planned for the little girl occurred. Though I feared I would run into another of whatever that thing with the flickering head was, I did not run into any more obstacles until I reached the front of the train. The carriages ended, with only a long trolley filled with coal and the engine just ahead of it. Just as I started to gather up enough courage to leap into the rough and jagged coal, I found myself nearly paralyzed with fear when a familiar voice spoke from behind me. "And where do you think you're going?" The conductor spoke directly into my ear. I spun in place to see his wide eyes and grinning face only inches from mine. He stood in place, leaning over at the waist to gaze directly at me. I could barely form anything close to actual words while we stared at one another. "Well, speak up, boy." His darkened eyes formed that unsettling scowl again. The good girl?" I asked in little more than a stuttered whisper. "Ejected, I'm afraid. Would you like to join her?" We just stared at each other for a moment. I was terrified that I was about to be launched from this very spot, only to crash down to the ground around us. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be a better option to whatever hell he had in store for me if I were to be permitted to remain on board. "I didn't think so," he said, wrapping his fingers around my face and lifting me from the snowy roof. I braced myself in preparation for being tossed like a rag doll, but he did not throw me over the side. He just stomped in wide strides, with me hanging from my head in his outstretched arm. He stepped in wide strides, crossing the carriages much faster than my tiny legs had, though I wouldn't say I was particularly comfortable, dangling like a fleshy Christmas ornament by the face. I was beginning to feel secure that my punishment may not be overly severe this time. Naturally, I got far too ahead of myself. He said, stopping in place. He glanced back into my eyes, one of which was covered by his large palm. "It's quite cool out here, isn't it?" With those words, my heart began to race again. One rule, the words echoed from the back of my mind. I hadn't broken the law of the train by climbing out of my seat. Not when I crossed through the other cars, nor when I tipped my attacker off the side. Stepping out into the cold night air in the first place, however, that's where I crossed the line. The smile on the conductor's face practically extended to his ears as the malice formed on his brow once more. He tilted his head to the side, studying what he could see of my face through his fingers. He reached his other hand up and snapped his fingers again, causing the hand which held me to burst into flames. The pain was immediate and unbearable. I screamed out as my skin bubbled, popped and dripped onto my shoulder, while fluids leaked down the conductor's arm. I could feel my flesh peeling away in thin sheets, while my eyeballs popped and oozed from their sockets. As the tall man paced on, I lost all track of the passage of time, existing only in the insufferable agony of my melting head. Somewhere along the line, I must have blacked out. It wasn't until my body was tossed onto the hard floor of the cabin behind the one which still held the other terrified children that I became aware once more. As soon as my regrown eyes opened, I grabbed at my face to find that everything felt intact again, though I remembered every single excruciating second before I passed out. "Should I strap you down, or will you behave?" he asked, glaring down at me with his hands behind his back. I just nodded, unable to make my voice work, hoping that he would understand which part of his question I was agreeing to. I grabbed onto the armrest of the chair closest to me and heaved myself up from the floor. I planted down into the seat, to which the conductor returned a nod. He then spun in place, stepped through the door, before gently sliding it shut. As soon as he was out of sight, I fell into wailing sobs, before curling up in the fetal position on the chair. Hours seemed to trickle by as I lay across the seats, trying my hardest to fall asleep to escape this nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, it was as though I saw myself from the outside, watching my face melt away. I also couldn't evade the guilt I was feeling from being unable to save the little girl who was apparently thrown from the train. I couldn't figure out why the conductor got so angry at her, nor why he appeared unaware of her even being there in the first place. Of course, nothing made any sense since I boarded this hell on wheels. After giving up on my attempts to sleep, I sat back upright in my seat to look out the window at the world beyond the glass. I no longer saw the same snowy landscape, but an unnerving lack of anything. It wasn't like the night sky had grown so dark, hiding the world behind its blanket. It was just nothingness. Though the train still felt as though it were speeding along the metal tracks, I saw no evidence of any road through the seemingly endless void. It was almost hypnotizing to look upon, though my mind could not make any rational sense of it. The longer I gazed through the glass, the more the emptiness mesmerized me. "Did he hurt you?" The voice practically caused me to leap from my skin as I sat, zoned out in front of the window. I slowly turned my body around to see Sophie, once more perched on the seat across from me. "Is it really you?" I asked, pressing my back against the glass, fearing this was some sort of trick being played on me. "Thank you," she cut her eyes down to the floor, "for trying to rescue me. He said he ejected you." I still wasn't ready to believe this wasn't some sort of cruel trick. "He tried. I thought I was done for, but I managed to grab onto the railing before I hit the ground." She still wouldn't meet my eyes, which only made me less willing to believe what she was saying. I just continued to stare at her. I couldn't even begin to fathom the odds of her claims being possible, even though I was just a child. Santa Claus? Yes, of course he was real, regardless of what my cousin thought. Scooby-Doo? Obviously based on true events. I'm sure he couldn't really talk, but they have to exaggerate things for TV. A young girl being tossed from a speeding train in the middle of an icy, cold expanse, luckily wrapping her fingers around a metal railing, saving herself from certain doom? Unlikely at best. "I swear I'm telling the truth," she pleaded, finally locking eyes with me, while sliding off her seat to cross the aisle towards me. I still pushed my body against the glass, terrified of the possibilities of what actually stood before me, dressed up as a little girl. That was until she sat beside me and placed her warm hand on the side of my face. There was something about her touch that caused my heart to regulate for the first time since stepping into this God-forsaken train. I hadn't even realized I was trembling this whole time, until my skin stopped shivering. My back relaxed, and my body almost drooped exhaustively from the weight of all of the pain and anguish I had suffered fading away into the background. Before I knew it, I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close to me. I laid my head on her shoulder and cried harder than I had in years, even more than after the conductor left me alone in this carriage. I wailed from the lingering guilt of the actions that led me here, along with so many others that had only now become clear. Yes, I was just a small child. It's easy to claim that I didn't know any better, but I did. Somewhere in the deepest pits in my mind, I knew what a spoiled and selfish little bastard I was, and for the first time ever, I wanted to change. I saw flashes of the exhausted looks on my parents' face when I would lose it in public or around others. I heard the sounds of my mother sobbing when I had pushed her way too far, so many times. At that very moment, as I spilled a seemingly endless river of tears onto Sophie's coat, I swore I would make things right if I was ever able to return to my home again. Truth be told, I could have sat there for hours, content in the arms of someone I had never laid eyes on before this day. But like every other fleeting fancy on this voyage of the damned, it was to be short-lived. I didn't even hear the door slide back open before the bellowing voice of the no longer smiling conductor raged from the front of the cab. "How did you get back here?" In an instant, Sophie pulled away from me and leapt from the seat to stand in the center of the aisle, glaring up at the tall man in the dark red suit, just as she had before. She didn't even appear frightened while they waged a staring battle that sent shivers up the length of my spine while forming goosebumps across my skin. "You have overstepped your bounds, Abigor," the little girl said, in a voice strong and proud. "This train is mine, Zophiel. You have no jurisdiction here." His voice sounded sinister as it moaned the words filled with sheer hatred. As the conductor slowly paced towards her, a long and jagged blade manifested in his hand, which reflected the dim lights of the cabin across the walls. While the pigtailed little girl stood her ground as David facing the hulking Goliath, I found myself filled with a purpose I had never felt before. Though it was similar to what struck me when he first pulled her from her seat in the other carriage. That urge, no, that need to protect her, this was far more intense. This child was special. She was sacred. I had never performed a selfless act my entire life. Well, all 10 years of it anyway. It was time for me to make my stand. My own fear practically melted away the instant I saw the man reach his sword high above his head to strike her down, while she bowed her head, seemingly accepting her fate. As the scene played out before me in almost slow motion, I jumped from my seat, pushing Sophie away from the approaching man. "Run," I said, offering a sincere smile to the girl who now stared at me with tears welling in her eyes. I stood in place, blocking her from the sword which sliced down through the air to split me in two. I closed my eyes, feeling content in the knowledge that her face would be the last thing I would ever see. An awful, self-consumed brat dies, so that a brave and wonderful little girl can live. Yeah, that's a fair trade. I felt proud of my actions, a feeling I had never before known. If you could make one wish, what would it be? I couldn't make out where the voice was coming from. I couldn't figure out where I was, for that matter. I had no body, not one that I could see or feel anyway. I could see, but everything was shielded by an intense bright light. I think it was my street, though it was hard to tell. Was it my street? Who exactly am I? It was as though everything was hidden in plain sight, behind a translucent curtain of sorts. So, what would you wish for? Anything at all? I asked through non-existent lips. Within reason, of course. I knew that voice. I had heard it only recently. She was familiar to me. But how? Where was I before I was here? It has to be something personal, something unique to you and your life. What do you mean? I was growing a vague awareness of who I was. But what was it that I desired? Some ask for riches, others for fame. That could be nice, I replied. Is that what I really wanted, though? There are those who wish for beauty. You could grow to be the most handsome of men. Attractive people do tend to have more doors open to them than others. Perhaps I could have it all. Money, fame, looks. No, that's not what I ached for. I had a wish, not too long ago. You could have a life many would envy. I could, couldn't I? No, that's not what I wanted. Not like this, anyway. Can I go back? The question presented itself before I even understood what I was asking for. Back? I did something, didn't I? I did something bad. What was it? I want to change something that happened. Yesterday. Was it yesterday? It wasn't long ago, was it? When is now, for that matter? Is that what you would wish for? You could have it all, you know. No, I made a mistake. I want to take it back. Can I wish for that? Please, let me change this one thing. Let me set things right. I think I remember now. It was bad. I was bad. One more chance. That's all I want. Perhaps you can... You know Santa's not real, right? You're 10 years old now. You're way too old for that baby shit. She was poking me in the chest, giggling after every sentence. I hated it when she acted like this. So what if I still wanted to believe? What's it to her anyway? The more she pushed and prodded, the more I could feel my face flush. If she was going to act this way, she shouldn't even be in my bedroom. "Stop it!" I screamed, pushing her back with every ounce of my strength after she jabbed me in the chest again. Her eyes widened and her lower lip quivered as she looked into my infuriated red face. Just as I readied myself to push her again, something struck me. Deja vu? Number, I remember this. There's something else. That scar in the center of my hand. Suddenly a veil lifted before my eyes. Memories spilled back into my mind as though they poured from a jug. My scowl softened. My face cooled. I looked up into the eyes of my older cousin and suddenly felt a stab of guilt. "What the hell?" Courtney cried out as I wrapped my arms around her. "I'm so sorry," I said while my eyes welled up. "You're so damn weird," she said, pushing me away before running down the stairs. I stood alone in my bedroom, watching her swiftly move out of my sight, descending the stairs the proper way, as she should have been permitted to do the first time. I turned my gaze back to the interior of my room, glancing at all of my wonderful belongings. More toys and games than the average kid could hope for, lazily scattered around my spacious bedroom. Items purchased with love, which I showed as little respect for as those who bought them for me. I practically sprinted down the steps towards the dining room, to where my parents stood surrounded by family and friends. I could tell my father tensed up as soon as I entered the room. No doubt he was prepared for yet another day of my whining, bitching, and moaning. The look on his face was almost comical when I ran forward to hug him. He and my mother shared a shocked stare, while I extended my arms around her too. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, reluctantly, while placing his hand on the top of my head. I just looked up at my folks with tears still trickling down my face. "I'm so sorry for everything. I promise I'm gonna try to be better. I love you both so much." They stared down at me and back at each other, completely lost for words. Things changed dramatically in the weeks that followed. That Christmas Eve I lived through twice. It took a while for my family to accept that I had actually changed my ways. But before long, I was closer to my mom and dad than I had ever been. Even Courtney became almost like a sister to me. Though she was a few years older than I, she only lived a few blocks away. She would babysit me for free when my folks would enjoy the occasional night out. Another thing they were hard-pressed to achieve when I was still a screeching, fit-pitching little brat, as nobody would have any desire to take care of me in their absence. The full memories of my experience on the train took some time to reform in the back of my mind, but the lessons I learned have stayed with me to this day. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the other children I shared that train car with. Perhaps they had their own trials to endure before they would be set free. I can only hope they succeeded as I did. On occasion, I allow myself to wonder if the entire experience had only been in my head, but the small circular scar that still remains on the palm and back of my hand would suggest that was not the case. Some years back, I married and fathered a child, a boy who is almost as prone to tantrums as I was at his age. My wife and I are trying everything we can, though little seems to have any effect. Maybe this is my karma for being such an insufferable little shit before I found a better way to live. Though my experience, almost 20 years ago now, still causes me to jerk awake from a graphic and horrific nightmare from time to time, I'm grateful for that hellish trip. My son is 10 years old now, the same age I was when my outlook changed for the better. I can't deny there's a little voice in the back of my head that secretly hopes the train arrives for him this Christmas Eve. Does that make me a bad parent? I've witnessed hell's invasion of the earth. It can be stopped. War is hell. It's an old adage, but an accurate one. The death, loss, and suffering, which comes from violent conflict, touches everyone involved, civilians and soldiers alike, and on all sides of the dispute. No one walks away unscathed. Some wars are necessary, of course. Nations have the right to defend themselves against unprovoked aggression, and populations are sometimes justified in rising up against oppressive governments and dictators. Wars can result in acts of bravery and heroism that are unparalleled in human history, but they will also unleash some of our darkest impulses, unlocking primal instincts and justifying terrible acts of violence which would be considered murder in times of peace. but the many conflicts we've seen over the centuries all have one thing in common. They've all been fought between human beings. But the final war, if and when it comes, will be one for the survival of our species, as we come together to desperately resist the legions of hell. By now you've no doubt read the accounts of my predecessors, the history enthusiast who visited a secret museum telling the story of a future apocalypse, and the student who unwittingly stumbled into an alternate universe, attending a lecture charting hell's victory over Allied and Axis forces during World War II. And who am I, you might ask? Well, that's not really important. I wish to remain anonymous for my own reasons, but let's just say that I have a vested interest in these tales of hellish conquests and extinction events. Many will write them off as nothing more than scary stories on the internet, but I always believed there was more to it. I went out to seek the truth and I found it. A big part of me wishes I hadn't embarked on this dangerous quest. The acts of bloody violence and wanton slaughter I've witnessed, those appalling images will be burnt into my memory forever. But still, I alone have seen the full picture, and I'm here to tell you the truth. Yes, we are facing a terrible fight for survival, and sadly many will suffer and die. But the outcome of the final war is not inevitable, and we are not facing this threat alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My fascination, or rather obsession, with the myth of the final war led me to some dark corners of the internet and far-flung places in my relentless search for clues. It was one of these hidden forums that led me to a unique living history tour, which one anonymous poster described as a life-changing experience. I recognized the code words, knowing how a similar post had led the history enthusiast to the hidden museum. And so, my curiosity got the better of me, and I took the bait. The location of the tour was marked by GPS coordinates. When I looked it up on Google Maps, I instantly had an eureka moment. The starting point of the tour was a field just south of Thiepval, on the banks of the River Somme in northeast France. This was, of course, the site of one of the bloodiest battles in human history, back during the blood-soaked summer of 1916, as Allied and German forces fought a horrific war of attrition in the muddy fields and trenches along a front line that barely moved in years. From my research, it seems that evil always enters our realm in these theaters of mass violence, using the blood and the darkness to their benefit, and drawing strength from the death and suffering to support their hellish invasion. This was the lead I'd been waiting for. I felt sure of it. I live in the UK, and so I travelled by car, embarking on the Eurotunnel shuttle from Folkestone to Calais and driving east to the Somme. I felt an incredible poignancy as I drove through the French countryside en route to Thiepval, passing the numerous graveyards and memorials. So many thousands had lost their lives here, little over a century ago, churned up in the bloody inferno of industrial warfare. If I'd had the time, I would have liked to pay my respects to the dead, but sadly my mission was too important, and I couldn't afford any distractions. I arrived about half an hour before the tour was due to start. This was intentional, as I wanted to learn the lay of the land before all hell broke loose, if you'll excuse the pun. I parked up alongside a narrow and seemingly abandoned country road at the exact spot the GPS coordinates had led me to. The location was quiet and peaceful, the sun shining down upon a field of red poppies, a beautiful but poignant display, given the poppies' emotive symbolism and close connection to the terrible losses suffered during the Great War. There was no one around that I could see. I spotted a farmhouse about half a mile to the north and could make out the banks of the Somme on the western horizon, but there wasn't another living soul in sight. For a brief moment, I forgot why I was there, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air and listening to the birds singing. I opened the gate and walked out into the field, picking a poppy and holding it in the palm of my hand. It was peaceful, But this wouldn't last. He appeared in the corner of my eye, making me jump in fright. I turned to face the man who stood behind me. I knew he hadn't been there a moment before, and so his sudden appearance was disconcerting. Even though I'd been warned to expect such an event, the physical appearance of the man largely matched the descriptions in the previous accounts, as he appeared near identical to the museum curator and university lecturer. He wore thick reading glasses and a tweed suit, while sporting a tidy beard and short haircut. I don't know whether it's the same individual in every story. Probably not. The more likely explanation is this: the entity has chosen to assume the identity of a seemingly harmless academic type. In reality, of course, he's anything but. It's his eyes that give him away, however, filled as they are with a barely concealed malice. He smiled thinly as he spoke, calling out to me across the field and speaking in a polite but somehow also sinister tone of voice. "Good morning, sir. What a pleasure to meet your acquaintance." He marched across the field, the innate grin still on his lips as he held out his hand in an act of false friendship. I reluctantly shook his hand, not wishing to blow my cover at this early stage. A chill went through me as I touched his ice-cold palm and looked into his dark, hateful eyes. "Have you come far?" he asked, whilst maintaining his amicable pretense. "Yes, quite far," I replied, "but the drive was rather pleasant." "Oh, excellent, excellent," he replied enthusiastically. "Well, I see no reason for further formalities. An educated man such as yourself knows the lay of the land. So, shall we begin our tour?" His choice of words concerned me. I wasn't surprised that the tour guide was expecting me. Somehow, they always knew when we were coming. But did he know my true agenda? I certainly hope not, because this would place me in extreme danger. Even at this late stage, I considered turning on my heels and running back to my vehicle, but I'd come this far and knew I had to see this through. "Sounds good," I responded, noting the sly glint in the tour guide's eye and his cruel smile which never faltered. But there was a further twist in the tale to come. A moment later, and a second figure appeared by our side, seeming to materialize out of thin air. I looked upon what appeared to be an elderly woman, hunched over and walking with the aid of a stick. Her head was covered by a shawl, and she also wore a heavy winter coat, despite the fact it was a warm summer's day. She glanced across at me, smiling sweetly, and exerting a positive aura that was in stark contrast to that of the devilish tour guide. Her skin was wrinkled, but her eyes still retained a bright spark, and she surprised me by shooting me a sly wink. I was both shocked and concerned by the old woman's presence here. The previous accounts hadn't mentioned anything about a third party being present during the event. I worried that this vulnerable lady had unwittingly stumbled into this very dangerous situation. My anxiety only increased when I noticed the guide's reaction to her sudden appearance. I watched in dismay as his face turned red with rage and he angrily spat out his words. "And who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" His tone was very aggressive, but as it turned out, the old lady was more than a match for him. "Good sir, I will ask you to show some manners. I am a guest who wishes to join your tour. Is this not permitted?" she asked. "It is out of the question," the guide shot back. "I have my guest, and this tour is one-on-one." She glanced over at me, a spark in her eye as she said, "I'm sure this gentleman won't mind if I tag along. What do you say, young man?" My mind was racing. I didn't want the mystery woman jeopardizing my mission, but at the same time felt reluctant to offend her. I stuttered my reply, saying, "Well, not as such." But I didn't get the chance to finish my sentence as she cut me off abruptly. "There, you see, it is not a problem. You'll hardly know I'm here." The guide still looked furious, glaring hatefully at the woman and then at me before he regained some level of self-control. "Fine." He finally relented. but you must not interrupt my talk or interfere with the tour in any way. Otherwise there will be hell to pay." I recognized a threat when I heard it, but the lady didn't seem to notice the sinister undertone behind his words, merely nodding her head and replying, "I'll be no trouble at all. Don't you worry, good sir." "Very well. Then let us begin." The guide continued, whilst motioning out towards the poppy-covered fields. "Welcome, guests, to this most solemn and sacred of sights. As you are aware, this location was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century. In the late summer of 1914, the European powers went to war, with an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia pitted against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The German High Command launched their Schlieffen Plan, mounting an invasion of Belgium and northeast France with the aim of capturing Paris and forcing the French out of the war. The German plan failed, however, as their armies were pushed back from the French capital, and a bloody war of attrition followed, with neither side able to make significant headway. Terrible weaponry was deployed: artillery, machine guns, poison gas. Casualties were horrific, and the blood-soaked, muddy, and rat-infested trenches soon turned into a hell on earth. During the summer of 1916, Allied forces launched their long-awaited offensive along the River Somme. The attack was preceded by a huge artillery bombardment lasting days. The British believed the German defenses couldn't survive such a heavy bombardment, but they were wrong. What followed was a bloodbath, one which ultimately resulted in 1 million casualties and made little change to the front. Right here where we stand, the British X-Corps pushed forward across no man's land on the 1st July 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. On this ground, just over 100 years ago, thousands of men died under a rain of fire. It's hard to imagine such death and suffering occurred here, isn't it? "Yes," I answered truthfully, as I cast my eyes over the tranquil fields. "Time is a great healer," the old woman added. "Well, time isn't something which concerns us here. We offer a unique experience, one which allows our guests to see and hear firsthand what war is really like." I stared at the tour guide in confusion, asking, "What do you mean?" The guide smiled sadistically and my heart froze, because I knew something bad was coming. But the trick that bastard pulled was really unexpected. All he had to do was click his fingers to turn the world upside down. I felt a surge of energy and was temporarily blinded by an intense light brighter than the sun. I fell down to my knees, covering my eyes behind my hands, and when I opened them again, I found myself in another place, or more accurately, another time. The poppy fields, trees, tidy fences, and farmhouse were replaced by a dead landscape of mud, barbed wire, and shell craters. The sun had risen on the far horizon, but there was no joy in this new morning. As soon as I surveyed my surroundings, my eardrums were almost burst by a series of almighty explosions, an unholy fire raining down from above. I looked to the east and saw the shells falling, the blast hitting the trench line and concrete bunkers. When I turned to the west, I saw the guns lighting up on horizon with a second trench line in front of them. To my horror, I realized we'd been transported back to July 1916, right in the middle of the battle. What's worse, the three of us were standing in no man's land between the British and German lines. I told myself it couldn't be possible, that this must be an optical illusion of some kind, but it all seemed so real. The mud beneath my feet, the thundering sound of the artillery barrage, and even the smell, the cordite, smoke, and awful stench of rotting corpses. I was understandably terrified because I'd suddenly found myself standing in the most dangerous spot on Earth, stuck between two industrial-age armies and their deadly array of weaponry. But when I looked to my mysterious companions, I saw they had no such fear. "Do not worry, sir," said the guide. this voice somehow audible even above the hellish din of the artillery. "You are quite safe as long as you stay by my side." I looked to the old lady for assurance as she seemed privy to whatever devilish trick the guide had pulled to bring us to this hellscape. "This man will lie to you about most things, but on this, he is telling the truth," she confirmed. I shook my head in dismay, my brain still unable to comprehend what was happening to me. I knew going in that this wasn't going to be easy and had fully expected to witness terrible things, but this was beyond my wildest imagination. I froze to the spot, suddenly realizing that the artillery bombardment had ended and an eerie silence had come over the battlefield. But of course, it didn't last. Then I heard the series of sharp whistles from the British trench line, and I watched on in horror as ladders were raised and helmeted. Tommies emerged, striding out into the killing fields. "My God," I swore, and tears rolled down my cheeks as I watched the tragedy unfold. "And here they come, lambs to the slaughter," said the tour guide, a sick smile across his face as he spoke. "Lions led by donkeys," the old lady added, a terrible sadness in her voice. The first wave of soldiers were barely out of the trenches before the machine gun fire began, a relentless barrage of bullets which cut human beings to shreds. Soldier after soldier fell, dropping dead or wounded in the mud and wire, their awful screams audible even above the heavy din of gunfire. But still they came, company after company of brave men throwing themselves into the breach, stepping over the bodies of their kinsmen as they pushed forward towards the German lines. We were literally standing in the middle of this living hell, watching as bodies fell all around us. But thanks to whatever black magic the guide had conjured, it appeared we were safe from harm. The soldiers on both sides weren't able to see us, and the bullets and shrapnel couldn't hurt us. There was death and devastation all around us, but it was like we were contained within some kind of protective bubble. But still, no man's land was a living hell, as young men continued to fall in a wanton slaughter, their fragile bodies torn apart by high-velocity bullets, and their blood and guts littering the battlefield. One young soldier fell only feet away from where I stood, dropping his rifle as a bullet pierced his chest. He looked up as he fell, his young eyes full of pain and fear. I swear he made eye contact with me for a brief moment before he took his final breath and left the mortal plane. The old lady walked up beside me and spoke into my ear. Such a sad thing to see a young life snuffed out so violently. He died alone and scared, so far from his home. What was his name? Where was he from? What were his hopes and dreams? Each death is its own individual tragedy, and there are so many. Her words moved me, but they clearly angered the guide. "Bah! Enough of this sentimental rubbish," he snarled. "War is war. And besides, the main event is still to come." I shot him a look, wondering what he meant, and all of a sudden everything stopped. The machine guns and artillery all ceased, and the advancing troops, those who were still alive, stopped in their tracks, simply standing still in the middle of no man's land. I felt concern, wondering what the hell was happening. Had a ceasefire been called? No, that couldn't be right. It didn't match the history I'd learnt. I had a terrible feeling deep in the pit of my stomach, knowing that something horrifying was about to occur. The ground beneath our feet shook, and I almost fell down into the mud. I looked to my companions and noted the sharp contrast in their expressions. The old lady's face was filled with sorrow, a look of sad resignation. Meanwhile, the guide was almost giddy as he watched the chaos unfold. Violence and death on this scale, this carnage always presents an opportunity for our forces. But of course, you already know this, don't you, sir? He winked at me in a frightening fashion, and I knew right then that he was on to me. I opened my mouth to speak but didn't get the chance to respond, as a moment later the two trench lines lit up in a fiery inferno. In a panic, I looked up into the morning sky and saw hundreds of fireballs descending, each the size of a car and each guided by an unseen force. They hit both the British and German lines simultaneously and with deadly precision, setting the trenches on fire and causing utter carnage. "Our initial attacks are infinitely more successful than the artillery strikes," announced the guide, delving deep underground and incinerating men inside their bunkers. "The mortals don't stand a chance." As if to emphasize his point, I heard the chilling cries of men being burnt alive, and my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of burning flesh. It was difficult to imagine a battle as brutal as the Somme becoming even more horrific, and yet this was what I was witnessing. I realized then that the demonic guide hadn't just transported me back in time, but also to another dimension, one where Hell's legions had chosen 1916 as their year of invasion. The fiery orbs always came first. I knew this from reading the previous accounts, but this wasn't the end of the assault. I turned slowly, seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. Glancing downwards, I was horrified to witness the dead soldier suddenly twitch and then move, his body brought back to life by a dark force. His joints cracked as he clumsily stood, his eyes dead and his jaw hanging open. He looked like some kind of meat puppet, held up by invisible strings, and for a brief moment or rather it, stood still, seeming to stare straight at me. When it charged, I screamed and my instincts told me to flee, but when I tried to run, the old lady grabbed my arm tightly, holding me back. I was surprised by how strong she was. "Don't," she ordered. "If you leave this circle, you will die." And she was right. The reanimated soldier ran right past us, instead sinking its teeth into another British Tommy, hungrily devouring a young man who may have been his friend only minutes before. I turned away in disgust from the gore, only to discover this gruesome scene was being replicated all across the battlefield, as thousands of British and German soldiers came back in a zombified state, launching savage attacks against the living. Former enemies became allies as they desperately fought back against the zombie hordes, firing rifles and machine guns, and ultimately fighting back using bayonets and rifle butts. But it was futile, as every time a man fell dead, he would immediately come back on the enemy's side. Soon, all of No Man's Land was dominated by the zombie hordes, and they hunted down the survivors in a bloodthirsty frenzy, tearing men to pieces with their bare hands and feasting upon their still warm flesh. I was horrified, dropping to my knees and vomiting in the mud, my whole body shaking as I felt like I was going to pass out. The old woman placed a delicate hand on my shoulder and spoke soothing words in my ear. There, young man. What we are witnessing is pure evil. But you are strong, and we can get through this together." The guide responded with cruel mockery, however, looking down upon me with utter contempt. "Oh, dear sir, are you feeling poorly? All a bit too much for you, I suppose. Well, we're just about done at this location anyway. Time for a change of scenery. How about some sea air?" With that, he clicked his fingers for a second time, and I found myself transported to yet another time and place. I felt the sea breeze against my skin and sand beneath my feet. Looking across the sandy beach, I witnessed a heavily militarized coastline, with X-shaped tank traps and barbed wire, and with the cliffs above fortified with concrete bunkers and pillboxes. And then, I looked out to sea, reacting with shock as I witnessed a vast armada of warships and landing craft cutting through the waves and rapidly approaching the shoreline. The date, June 6, 1944. The guide stated, Omaha Beach, Normandy. After years of preparation, Allied forces launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France. The Allies enjoy a substantial superiority in the air and at sea. But the German coastal defenses are strong, and the first wave of infantry will be vulnerable. The supreme sacrifice those young men will make," the old lady added, "traveling halfway across the world to fight against an evil regime, all in the name of liberty. We bear witness to heroics even in these dark times. They fight because they believe in something greater than themselves." The guide snarled at the woman, casting her a hateful look. The tension between the two was growing, and I feared how it would end. But there wasn't time to think about that now, as once again the chaos of battle took hold all around us. Shells flew over our heads, with Allied destroyers bombarding the shore fortifications and German 88 guns shooting back at them. Several of the landing craft were hit, exploding into fiery infernos, the GIs on board dying horribly before they even reached the beach. The next wave didn't fare much better. As soon as the craft reached the shore and the landing ramps came down, a heavy barrage of bullets from the German machine guns tore into the American soldiers, killing and wounding dozens in a matter of minutes. But still they came, advancing up the beach, using the metal obstacles for cover as they returned fire and slowly pushed towards the cliffs. Many men were dying before my very eyes, and it was a horrific sight. But I was also confused. I was thinking back to the student's account, the one who attended the lecture in an alternate, hellish realm. In that dimension, Hell's legions had invaded in late 1942, and so the D-Day landings had never taken place. So what was this? What was the guide subjecting me to? Was I seeing the Normandy invasion in my own timeline, or was this the history of yet another alternate dimension? I soon got my answer. My heart froze as the ground shook and the battle suddenly paused. I knew what was coming next. My attention was drawn to the cliffside, as suddenly the German pillboxes were struck by deadly fireballs and exploded into flames. Some of the American GIs cried out in triumph, apparently believing that their side had done the damage. But sadly, they were mistaken. I turned towards the English Channel and witnessed the sea boiling, waves rising as something huge and horrifying emerged from the depths. I knew what it was, having read the previous accounts. But hearing the stories could never have prepared me for seeing the beast firsthand. As I stood in shocked awe, the guide walked up beside me, sporting a sadistic grin as he confirmed what I already knew. The Leviathan, terror of the seas, no man-made vessel can withstand its deadly grasp. As if to emphasize his point, the creature raised its enormous tentacles above the surface, wrapping them around the nearest Allied warship. I could only look on in horror as the beast used its immense size and strength to crush the steel hull. I heard a terrible screeching sound of crushed metal and of sailors crying out in absolute terror. The beast slowly pulled the destroyer downwards, condemning its crew to a watery grave. Its terrible task done, the beast moved on to its next target, attacking a second warship with impunity. The GIs on the beach had stopped fighting as all now looked back towards the sea, unable to comprehend the horror they were witnessing. Some of the landing craft had made landfall while others were still on the water. The landing was already in disarray. But Hell's forces had yet another devilish trick up their sleeves. I saw movement underneath the water's surface, as yet unseen predators swam into position and prepared to attack. The first beast leapt up from the water, literally jumping into a waterborne landing craft and tearing into the men inside in a bloody massacre. It all happened so quickly that I hadn't gotten a good look at the monster, but hundreds more were coming, emerging from the depths to attack both the boats and the shoreline. The best way I can describe them is sea serpents, each at least 20 foot long and covered in thick green scales, their eyes a hellish shade of red, and their hideous maws filled with dagger-like fangs. The beasts attacked with a predatory instinct, swimming the shallow waters and slithering along the sands. Soldiers screamed as they tried in vain to mount a defense, but the serpents leapt upon them, swallowing men whole in a horrifying massacre. I turned away, closing my eyes and covering my ears. Once again, the old lady came to my aid. Remember, young man, the so-called guide is a liar. You cannot trust what he shows you. I opened my eyes and raised my head, meeting her gaze as I shouted my angry reply. But this has happened. It is history. Maybe not in my world, but that doesn't make it any less real. The woman smiled thinly, shaking her head. The truth is not so simple, and there is always hope. She answered, pointing towards the cliff face. Look. I glanced over to the end of the beach, amazed to see German and American troops combining forces, forming a defensive cordon and shooting down serpents, killing several as they held the line against all the odds. Very admirable, the guide said, but sadly futile. He nodded his head upwards, and I saw the monsters descending from the blue skies, merely dots at first, but then I made out their true form. Harpies, winged demons, red-scaled and armed with razor-sharp fangs and claws. Hundreds of monsters stealthily dived from above and launched their surprise assault upon the exposed human soldiers. I saw the massacre coming and cried out a warning, forgetting for a moment that these men could neither hear nor see me. The guide cackled cruelly as the winged beasts tore into their prey, ripping bodies apart in a sickening bloodbath. For all their bravery, these men couldn't withstand this combined attack, and soon the serpents and harpies slaughtered them in their hundreds, the foul beasts fighting each other as they hungrily devoured their victims. Once again I turned away in disgust, not wanting to meet the old lady's eye because I knew she'd lied to me. She also remained silent, and so it was left to the demonic guide to speak next. Well, I think we've seen enough. Time to move on to our next location. Another click of his fingers and a blinding flash, and we were shifted to yet another hellish alternate dimension. The first thing that hit me was the stifling heat and the thick air, a humidity which made me sweat and struggle to breathe. I opened my eyes and found myself surrounded by a dense tropical forest, tall trees towering above us, and a thick vegetation crudely cut back by human hands. I realized then that the guide had transported us to a different continent, as well as time and dimension. We were now in the tropics and witnessing a very different type of conflict. In most dimensions, the Second World War ends with the Allies victorious. The guide calmly explained, but soon after, a Cold War breaks out between the United States and Soviet Union, as an Iron Curtain descends and the world is divided between the communist and capitalist blocs. The advent of nuclear weapons makes all-out conflict unlikely, as neither side wants to risk triggering an apocalypse. This development frustrates my master's objectives, but there are still opportunities in the chaos, as the two superpowers vie for control and influence across the globe. This results in brutal proxy wars such as this, unconventional conflicts, but no less brutal and bloody. He paused briefly, waving his hand to draw attention to our surroundings. Welcome to Indochina, 1968. America has poured in vast numbers of troops and firepower in an attempt to defeat the communist insurgency, but their war effort is frustrated by the tenacity of the guerrilla forces. A bloody stalemate ensues and, as always, we are ready to step into the darkness. Our attentions were drawn to the skies above as I heard the recognizable drone of rotor blades and spotted the Huey troop-carrying helicopter descending, noisily making landfall in the rice paddy field where we stood. The powerful gust of hot air hit me, and the intense sound of the rotor blades spinning blocked out all other sounds. We watched as a squad of 8 heavily armed U.S. infantrymen jumped out from the chopper's side door and set up a defensive perimeter on the edge of the field, their weapons facing out towards the tree line. And then the helicopter ascended, slowly pulling up from the field and back into the blue skies, whilst leaving the troops behind to perform their mission. The soldiers couldn't see us, of course, but we were able to observe them at close quarters as they formed up and began their designated patrol into the jungle. We followed after the men, remaining inside of our protective bubble thanks to whatever dark magic the guide had evoked, but still exposed to the sights, sounds, and smells of the tropical forest, and of course the stifling, exhausting heat. I could tell how tense the soldiers were under the circumstances, twitching at every rustle of leaves, whispering about ambushes and punji traps. This was the frightening reality of counterinsurgency warfare, where an attack could come from anywhere at any time, and there were no clearly defined front lines. We hadn't walked for long before we reached a clearing, casting our weary eyes upon a small village of bamboo huts, and my nostrils were again hit by the foul stench of death. We watched as the American soldiers discovered the first body, followed by another and another. The squad would have descended into blind panic had it not been for the stern orders of their sergeant. "Keep your shit together, boys," he boomed. "We still have a job to do. Watch the tree line and look out for booby traps." His men reluctantly obeyed orders, but the panicked conversation continued as more bodies were found. We saw what they saw, and I was sickened by the carnage. Clearly, the dead weren't Viet Cong fighters, but rather unarmed civilians, old men, women, and children. Not only that, but their bodies were badly mutilated, torn apart, leaving blood and entrails scattered across the forest floor. There were seemingly no survivors, as even the village's livestock, goats and chickens, had been similarly slaughtered. It was sickening. We listened to the troops' hurried chatter as the situation grew even more tense. "What the fuck? Did Charlie do this?" one young private asked. "Maybe, although I've never seen a massacre like this," replied the sergeant. "I don't think humans did this," chirped in another man. "Look at the bite marks on the bodies. It looks like an animal attack to me." "That's crazy," answered the sergeant. "No animal could do this." But he didn't sound too sure. There was a terrible atmosphere in the air as the soldiers held a silent vigil over the dead. It seemed certain that something bad was about to occur, and so it was hardly a surprise when the attack was launched. A man screamed, pointing to the deep undergrowth as a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the shadows. There followed a deep, animalistic growl, and then bloody chaos. A beast moved rapidly out into the open, a blur of fur and teeth that pounced upon the nearest soldier before he could react. The man screamed, firing his M16 blindly into the air as he was knocked down and then mauled in a gruesome manner, the beast tearing into his chest and ripping out his heart. The rest of his squad reacted with shock, as nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for this. "Contact!" the sergeant cried, as he raised his rifle and fired. "Holy shit! They're everywhere!" screamed another man. And sure enough, several more of the hellish beasts emerged from the surrounding forest, launching savage attacks at lightning speed. The remaining soldiers fired wildly in all directions, but the creatures moved so rapidly that they couldn't get a fix on them. I could only watch on in abject horror as man after man got cut down in a frenzied assault. One soldier's head was sliced off with a single swipe of a claw, while several others were dragged into the forest, still screaming frantically as they clawed at the dirt in a futile attempt to escape. The sergeant was the last man standing, and he managed to shoot and wound one of the beasts before two others grabbed him from both sides, using immense strength to rip his arms from their sockets. It was only then that I got a good look at the creatures as they finished the slaughter and feasted upon the flesh of their newest victims. They were werewolves, half man, half canine. Their eyes burning a demonic red, and their blood-filled maws filled with razor-sharp teeth. I had heard mention of such creatures in the previous accounts, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing them in the flesh, or for the speed and savagery of their attack. "Soulless, savage beasts," the old lady muttered as she came by my side. They do not discriminate in their victims and belief in nothing. Their only desire is to satisfy their unrelenting hunger and bloodlust. "You're wrong," the guide shot back angrily. "It is true that our shock troops do not discriminate. Capitalist or communist, soldier or civilian, their flesh all tastes the same. But these beasts do serve a higher purpose. They are loyal to their master, and his goal is clear: to destroy mankind and gain dominion over the earth. In this, he will succeed." "I wouldn't be so sure of that," the old lady replied cryptically. The two bizarre individuals glared at each other for a long moment, as the werewolves continued to feast on dead men. I could tell the passionate hatred they held for each other, and for a second feared that violence would ensue. But then the guide broke the silence, speaking with the same cruel smile etched across his lips. "Well, I guess further proof is required, even after everything we've seen. But that's okay. I have a special surprise in store for our guest." He stared at me with his evil eyes, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Sir, you are an Englishman, are you not?" he inquired. "Yes," I replied nervously, fearing where this was going. "Very good," the guide continued. "Let's take a glimpse at your country's near future." Another flash of light, and suddenly I found myself in my home city of London, standing on that I believed was Oxford Street. But it was not the busy shopping district I remembered. England's capital had been transformed into a post-apocalyptic hellscape, with the streets abandoned, shop fronts smashed open and looted, and the skyscrapers and historical buildings burning. "Welcome home," the guide sneered with a perverse satisfaction. "Not quite as you remember it, I expect. The year is 2020-something. Well, why ruin the surprise? Now watch." I felt a rage building up inside me as I clenched my fists. I wanted to beat the bastard bloody, but the old lady stopped me. "Keep your cool, young man," she cautioned. "Don't let him provoke you. This will all be over soon." I was still angry and frightened, but events were playing out in front of my very eyes. At the far end of the street was a barricade manned by a platoon of British soldiers, most armed with SA-80s, but some carrying Javelin anti-tank missile launchers. The infantrymen were supported by a Challenger main battle tank which blocked off the street. I guessed these troops were mounting a last-ditch defense, but from what? I soon got my answer. The ground shook beneath our feet, and I heard a loud thumping on the asphalt, a thunderous booming sound which grew ever louder. Suddenly, a huge creature smashed through one of the ruined buildings, emerging onto the previously empty street. I looked up, horrified to see a demon 50 to 60 foot tall, with the horned head and hoofed feet of an animal, but the body of a man, adorned in thick steel armor. Its eyes burned a fiery red, and it opened its huge mouth to reveal rows of shark-like teeth. The beast emitted a terrifying roar which filled the air, and it charged down the street towards the troops, the ground shaking underneath its huge hooves. The soldiers opened up with every weapon at their disposal. The rifle rounds had no effect, merely deflecting off the demon's armor like pebbles bouncing off a metal sheet. But then the Challenger opened fire with its main cannon, producing an almighty boom. The shell was propelled across the void and smashed into the demon's armor-plated chest. The heavy projectile stopped the monster in its tracks. It roared in pain and anger, but the shell didn't bring him down, instead only temporarily delaying its advance. What happened next was either the result of great skill or a total fluke. A javelin missile soared through the air and hit the charging demon directly in its left eye. The projectile tore through the soft tissue and exploded inside the demon's brain. The monster was killed instantly, its huge frame falling and crashing down onto the street only yards away from where we stood, the sheer weight of its enormous body cracking the concrete beneath it. The soldiers cried out in triumph, and I shared their elation. From what I'd read in the previous accounts, these Goliath-like demons were thought to be virtually indestructible. But what I'd just seen proved they could be killed. But then I remembered something else from the stories, that these demons always fought in threes. The second demon suddenly emerged at the far end of Oxford Street, raising a crossbow-like weapon to its shoulder and firing. A bolt tore through the air as fast as any man-made missile, smashing into the tank and tearing through its thick armor, reducing the high-tech war machine to a flaming wreck. The surviving soldiers were left in disarray, as suddenly the third demon stomped down the street from behind them, roaring with fury as it swung its huge, fiery sword. I could only watch in abject horror as the demon killed a half-dozen troops at once, slicing them in half and staining the footpath with blood and gore. The survivors broke, fleeing in all directions whilst firing wildly at their giant attackers. I doubted they would get far. "Well, that's the end of that," the guide said, with the same cruel smirk on his face. He pointed to the entrance of the tube station across the road. "The rats always flee underground at times like this. Let's take a look." He began walking across the rubble-strewn tarmac, ignoring the monstrous demons as they picked off the remaining soldiers one by one. I didn't follow straight away, instead looking to the elderly woman for reassurance. "It won't be easy," she explained. "But you need to see this. It's too late to turn back now, young man." I nodded my head, and we proceeded across the street, following the guide down the stairs to the station below ground. Once we'd passed through the smashed-up turnstiles, we witnessed yet another horrifying scene, perhaps the worst yet. There were a few other soldiers down here, a mix from different regiments and even some armed Met police officers. They all appeared exhausted and terrified, but still maintained a loose cordon along the station's platform. But the true horror was behind the armed men and women, several hundred civilians, men, women and children, all huddled together along the platform. I looked into those faces and saw nothing but fear and pain. All were dirty and emaciated refugees in their own country, seeking sanctuary underground, since the enemy now controlled the streets above. The London Underground had served as a refuge before, back in the dark days of the Blitz during World War II. But now the displaced Londoners were hiding from an enemy more evil than even the Nazis. We walked across the platform, unseen by the military personnel and huddled refugees. An officer was screaming into a radio, desperately pleading for outside assistance. There was nothing I could do but listen. "God damn it, man," he shouted. "I have over 500 civilians down here. We need an immediate evacuation." "I'm sorry, Colonel," came the sheepish reply from the other end. "No helicopters are available. There's nothing we can do." "I won't accept that," the colonel screamed. "Let me speak with your superior officer." "Hold, please," came the nervous reply. A tense pause followed before the static was replaced by a new voice, a female voice, confident but also exhausted. Her tone indicated immediately that it wasn't good news. "Colonel, this is your Prime Minister speaking." The officer's eyes bulged, and he visibly gulped before responding. "Ma'am?" "I'm very sorry, Colonel," she continued. "This is the most difficult decision a leader will ever have to make, and I thought I owed it to you. To tell you in person." There was a tense pause, as it seemed the politician was struggling to find the words. "My military advisors tell me there is no other alternative. I have authorized Operation Holy Fire. Trident has been deployed. I am so sorry, Colonel. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." And with that, the radio call was abruptly ended. The colonel was in a state of shock, still holding on to the receiver as he looked upon the huddled refugees, his eyes wide with horror. And I understood why. Trident meant nuclear weapons. The British government had decided to nuke their own capital. That's what it had come to. What madness, what desperation had led them to this place. Mercifully, there wasn't long to wait before the terrible end. A thunderous boom and a wall of fire, and the ceiling collapsed, burying hundreds of screaming civilians and soldiers under tons of debris. I fell to my knees, covering my eyes and ears in a futile attempt to drown out the horror. But it was all over almost as quickly as it had begun, and the smug guide transported us back to the present day. I found myself curled up in a ball on the platform of Oxford Circus tube station, the guide and old lady standing over me as puzzled commuters pushed past us. "Are you all right, mate?" asked one man, as he looked down upon me with concern. I quickly composed myself, wiping the cold sweat off my forehead as I stood up on my shaking legs. "Yes, I'm fine," I answered sheepishly, although in reality I was anything but. I'd been dragged through hell and back, but I knew this wasn't over. I looked to my two companions but found they were almost oblivious to my presence, glaring at each other across the crowded platform. "Time to end this," the guide snarled through clenched teeth. "Agreed," the woman replied, "but not here." "Fine," the guide answered before he clicked his fingers again. Another flash of light and we went to another place. In an instant, I was hit by a freezing cold wind that chilled me to my bones. Looking around, I saw we were now stood upon a frozen mountain, with nothing but white snow in every direction. My teeth chattered, and my whole body shook uncontrollably as the guide spoke. "The Watkins Range, Greenland. Nothing much has ever happened here, but it is isolated and far away from curious eyes, and so will serve our purpose." I continued to shiver, wondering how I could survive this intense cold. The old lady broke eye contact with her adversary, looking down upon me with sympathy in her eyes. To my shock, she removed her heavy coat, revealing the frail body underneath. "Here you go, young man," she said, whilst holding the coat out to me with her bony hand. I shook my head and muttered through my blue lips, "I can't." No matter how cold I wasn't going to deprive an 80-year-old woman of her winter coat. "Trust me," she replied with a kind smile. "You need it more than I do." Somehow I believed her, and I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth, so I took the coat and put it on, savoring the warmth and protection it offered. "Very touching," the guide mocked. "You're quite the guardian angel, aren't you?" "I do what I can to bring some small comfort," the lady replied, whilst fearlessly meeting the guide's eye. "You bloody bitch," he spat out hatefully, this face turning red with fury. "You think I don't know who you really are? I clocked you as soon as I saw you." "How very perceptive of you," she replied sarcastically. This only added to the guide's anger. "What the fuck are you doing here?" he shouted. "I'm here to stop you." She responded firmly, without missing a beat. He laughed in cruel mockery before answering. "You still don't get it, do you? We will win. Earth will fall and humanity shall perish. That's inevitable. In every timeline we will ultimately emerge victorious." The woman smiled faintly before delivering her rebuttal. "Nothing is inevitable. The future is not set in stone, and whatever evils your master has perpetrated can be undone. You will not win." "Enough talk," the guide screamed, his eyes bulging with rage. "Let's settle this." And then hell really did break loose. The first thing I noticed was the guide's eyes turning a hellish shade of red, and then the horns which suddenly extended from his forehead. His white teeth become fangs and his body grew at an impossible rate, as his height doubled, then trebled. And it didn't stop there. I stepped back, looking up in horrified awe as our former guide transformed into one of the Goliath-like demon foot soldiers, close to 60 foot tall, his hooves buried deep in the snow. He roared at a deafening volume, so loud that I feared he might cause an avalanche, but instead, he produced a huge sword, easily 3 times the length of a man. The hideous weapon burned red with a fiery intensity, suddenly heating up the otherwise freezing environment. I was horrified to witness the so-called guide in his monstrous true form, a soldier of hell ready to do battle. But I wasn't his target. The beast focus was the old lady, and, on paper, it couldn't have been a greater mismatch. But the elderly woman wasn't as she appeared either. When I glanced back in her direction, I saw she was changing too, turning into a much younger and stronger woman. Her hair silver and eyes a striking shade of deep blue. Her body grew too, and soon she towered over me. But that wasn't all. I watched in astonishment as the woman extended a pair of huge wings from her back, flapping them smoothly as she rose up from the snow-covered ground. And then I finally understood. The woman wasn't human. She was an angel. My guardian angel in disguise, protecting me this whole time. Her former walking stick became a sword of white light, almost as long as I was tall. At her full height, she was at least 12 foot tall, but still dwarfed by the giant demon opposing her. I didn't know how she could win this fight, but my angel was full of surprises. The demon roared once more, charging across the snow as the whole mountain shook beneath his huge hooves. He swung his mighty sword with brutish strength, attempting to slice the angel in two. But while he had the size and strength, she had the speed and agility. The angel flew out of the path of the fiery sword, deftly avoiding the killer blow. The demon roared in frustration as it pulled its sword out of the snow, but the angel had already launched her counterattack, soaring in low and cutting her enemy across his thigh, slicing deep into his exposed flesh. The monster cried out in pain, angrily swinging its sword in her direction, but once again she dodged the blow and struck back. This routine was repeated several times over, with the demon thrashing out and the angel avoiding the blows before launching her own small attacks, cutting the beast repeatedly on his chest, arms, and legs. I guess she was trying to kill the demon through 1,000 cuts, gradually draining his strength and bleeding him out. It was a good strategy, but her luck didn't last. The angel was a fraction too late as the fiery sword came down upon her. She managed to parry the heavy blow with her own sword, but the sheer force of the strike knocked her out of the sky, throwing her body backwards as she hit the ground hard. I gasped in horror, looking to the spot where my guardian angel had fallen and silently begging her to get up. But it seemed like she was incapacitated. The demon sported a sadistic grin, showing his shark-like teeth as he raised his mighty sword and went in for the kill. I feared it was all over. But at the last possible second, the angel opened her eyes and moved. The demon's sword was harmlessly buried in the snow as the angel darted upwards, extending her sword and screaming with a righteous fury as she soared upwards, acting like a missile homing in on its target. She hit the demon square in the chest, stabbing him right where his heart would be. The monster cried out in agony, its huge frame suddenly falling backwards as the angel withdrew her sword from his flesh, letting the monster's red blood spill over the pure white snow. The demon landed heavily on the mountainside, the sheer weight of its immense body shaking the ground underneath him. But the mortally wounded monster would transform once again in its dying moments, changing back into its human form. The guide lay inside the huge crater, his heart pierced as he bled heavily. The angel and I ran to his side, getting there just in time to hear his final words. The demonic entity laughed, even as he choked on his own blood. "You think this is over?" he spluttered, his eyes still full of hatred as he glared up at us. "You think you've won, but you're wrong. My master will not stop. He will continue the fight. And we will be ready for him," the angel replied defiantly. The guide tried to speak again, but instead the blood poured from his open mouth, and he closed his eyes for the last time. I breathed a deep sigh of relief, although was still in a state of shock after witnessing the violent struggle. The angel sheathed her sword and smiled at me sympathetically, her eyes now filled with kindness. "Come on, young man. Let's get you home." There followed a flash of light, and suddenly I was back where it had all started, the poppy field in northeast France, in the current day, and my own timeline. I looked to my companion and saw she had returned to her previous form, that of an elderly, frail, and seemingly harmless lady. She held out a hand expectantly and said, "My coat, please." I gladly removed the garment and handed it back to her, although I wouldn't soon forget the warmth and comfort the coat had offered me in my time of need. I watched as she put the garment back on to cover her frail form, although I now knew this was merely a facade. "I am grateful to you," I said nervously, "but there is so much I still don't understand." She smiled at that. "You understand more than you think. You came here looking for answers and you found them. The threat posed by the legions of hell is very real, and someday, perhaps someday soon, they will launch their invasion of your world. The conflict will be brutal and bloody, and sadly many will perish. But the outcome is not inevitable. You are not alone in this fight, and together we can triumph against evil. You just need to keep the faith." She paused, looking out over the fields and pointing towards the bright sun on the far horizon. "Even here there is beauty, after all the suffering and death that once occurred where we stand. There is always hope for a brighter future. Remember that, young man." I looked to the horizon briefly, and when I turned back the woman was gone, leaving me alone in the field with my thoughts. So, there you have it, good people, my story in its entirety. It's far-fetched, and many of you may not believe it, but I swear my account is the truth. I'm telling you all this to back up my predecessors and also to pass on the warning. War is coming, but all is not lost. There is much darkness in this world, but there is also light. And they say the night is always darkest before the dawn. Godspeed, my friends. Walking the line, I awoke in a standing position, my eyes suddenly shooting open and my legs weakening as I began to stumble. I panicked as I felt myself falling forward, instinctively reaching out to grab the nearest thing to hand, which happened to be the shirt of the guy standing in front of me. "Watch it, buddy," he exclaimed in annoyance, although the mystery man did take hold of my arm and shoulder before helping me to steady myself. "Are you okay?" he asked sympathetically. "Yeah, I think so," I replied through trembling lips as I tried to get my bearings. "Well, just keep your cool," he instructed, "and whatever you do, don't step over the white lines." I didn't understand what he meant, but then I adjusted my eyes and surveyed the scene around me, and what I saw was a vision of hell. I hadn't seen the face of the man who'd helped me, but when I looked up, I could make out the back of his head in the darkness, and realized he'd turned around after assisting me, now facing forward. Darkness was all around me, but there was a dim illumination on the ground which I stood upon. 2 lines of white light about 3 feet apart, one to the left of me and the other on my right. I remembered what the man had told me a moment earlier, warning me not to step outside of these lines. I didn't know what he meant, but somehow realized this was probably good advice. I creaked my head to one side, looking over the shoulder of the man ahead, and seeing a line of people standing in front of him, a long single-file queue of shadowy figures stretching for several hundred yards, up what appeared to be a slight elevation. All stood within the 2 white lines which seemed to operate like some kind of emergency lighting, and at the top of the queue of unidentified figures was a doorway of bright, almost blinding light, a literal beacon in a sea of darkness, inviting, comforting, and offering a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a dangerous situation. I didn't understand what this place was or why I was here, but in that moment, I believed the shining white light ahead was my salvation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people standing in the queue in front of me, and I couldn't move past them without stepping outside of the white lines. I shook my head, experiencing an almost crippling anxiety as my mind raced to make sense of this inexplicable situation. I opened my dry lips and struggled to speak, addressing my fearful question to the anonymous man in front of me. What is this place? How did we get here? He didn't turn his head to face me, but the man did respond. You see the white light at the front of the line? He asked in a surprisingly calm voice. Yes, I confirmed nervously. Well, look behind you, he instructed. I was terrified, but needed to know the truth, and so I turned my head, making sure to keep my footing and stay within the lines as I did so. Directly behind me stood a woman about 5'5" tall. I could barely make out her features in the dark, but, in any case, her head was down, and it appeared she was unconscious. She was sleeping while standing up, just as I had been only moments before. I guess this was the same for every person in the line, and that we'd all been unconscious when they brought us here. But who had done this to us, and why? I decided this was a question for later. I suppose I should have paid more attention to the sleeping woman behind me, and if I'd done so, I would surely have recognized the young lady, but my attention was drawn to the scene beyond her. I soon realized I was standing in the middle of a long queue that stretched back for at least several hundred yards and sloped downwards, and at its end was the polar opposite to the light before me. At the very bottom of the line was a swirling vortex of crimson red, a terrifying portal to God knows where, so vile and sinister that I couldn't bear to look upon it for more than a few seconds. If the light before us offered hope and salvation, the blood-red whirlpool surely represented doom and despair, and the mere sight of it chilled me to my very bones. I turned back around, muttering a profanity under my breath as my body shook. It gets worse. The man in front said ominously, "Look ahead." I creaked my head once again and saw a terrifying scene unfolding. I guess another man had suddenly woken up like I had, but he didn't react well to his surroundings. I watched in awestruck horror as the darkened figure stumbled, swearing as he put his foot forward and stepped outside of the white lines. Someone else in the queue tried to stop him, reaching out to grab the disorientated man while shouting, "Don't do it, man. We can't leave the queue no matter what." But the well-meaning person's efforts were in vain, as the man he was trying to save ignored the warning, slapping his hand away whilst shouting, "Get away from me, you damn freak." And then he put both feet across the line on his right-hand side and walked out into the darkness. I say dark, but I could still make out his shape once he was over the line. He was a big guy, over 6 feet in height and well-built. I guess he didn't scared easily and thought he could find a way out, but he didn't get far. I guess he was about 10 yards out before they got him. Thankfully, I couldn't see much in the dim light, and it all happened so fast, but the creatures that emerged from the black void were horrifying, imp-like demons the size of grown men, but with eyes which burnt a deadly shade of red, and with claws and teeth like those of the deadliest predators. There were 3 monsters in total, and they all roared like lions, moving so rapidly as they surrounded the doomed man and tore at him with their long and sharp claws. Their victim screamed in absolute terror as the monsters ripped his clothes and skin. Next, the horrified man tried to fight and make his way back to the relative safety of the queue, but soon he was knocked over and seriously wounded by a deep slash along his back. Even then, he didn't give in, crawling along the hard ground as he desperately cried for help. Not one person attempted to reach him, however, as all remained frozen to their spots. And of course, he didn't make it. A moment later, one of the demons grabbed him by the legs, pulling his body away from the line as he screamed and tried in vain to dig his nails into the ground. Before long, the monsters and their victim disappeared into the darkness. We could no longer see them, but we did hear the vicious attack reaching its horrifying conclusion. The doomed man screamed louder as his predatory attackers growled with sadistic glee, And then I heard the appalling sounds of skin ripping, bones cracking, and finally, what I can only assume was the noise of the monsters feasting on his still warm flesh. What the fuck? I swore aloud. I retched, feeling like I was going to be sick, but nothing came up. Panic soon spread along the entire line as people reacted to the vicious killing we'd all just witnessed. Some deteriorated into screaming hysterics, whilst others fell into themselves, whimpering or quietly praying under their breath. But all were in agreement on one point. We must not step outside of the white lines. Stepping out of the queue meant certain death, while within the lines we were safe, for now at least. I shivered as I tried to come to terms with the extreme violence I'd just seen. It seemed like the temperature had suddenly dropped, or perhaps this was just my brain's perception. In any event, my mind was now racing, and I wanted to ask 100 questions at once. I noticed how the man in front of me had hardly reacted to the savage attack. It was like he'd expected it to happen. I also recalled how he'd helped me when I first woke up, but I was still to see his face, and even now he would not turn around. He'd been the one who'd warned me about the rules, and that simple advice had probably saved my life. Nevertheless, I had the distinct feeling that his faceless man knew more about our situation than he'd shared thus far, and so I was determined to ask him further questions. But before I got the chance, I was disturbed by a soft cry from behind me. I jumped in shock and turned around, almost accidentally putting my right foot over the line before I stopped myself. Once I'd turned, I saw the woman behind me slowly falling, and I reached out to catch her, taking hold of her slender body and helping her back up to her feet. I felt a familiarity as I held her in my arms. Perhaps it was her scent, or maybe my muscle memory. But then she lifted her head and met my eye, and I almost jumped out of my skin once I saw her face. "Sally?" I said in astonishment, as if my eyes were deceiving me. "Joshua?" she answered weakly, as she opened her eyes and slowly adjusted to our new environment. I saw her dark hair tied back in a bun, her soft skin and her expressive green eyes, and knew it was indeed her. And Sally's presence in this hellish realm brought the terror I felt to a whole new level. I held onto Sally's body as she regained her composure, and continued to do so until she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. And I was still thinking of what to say as I looked into her frightened eyes, and a flood of old emotions came back to me, some good, others bad. In the end, I could only repeat the crucial advice I'd been given, saying, "Don't step outside of the lines, Sally. Whatever you do, stay inside the lines." Sally looked up at me in confusion, and I was prepared for a stream of follow-up questions which I likely couldn't answer. But before we got the chance to speak, the man in front of me spoke, asking, "Do the two of you know each other?" Yeah. I answered without thinking. "Sally and I used to date." Interesting," the man replied without elaborating. He was still facing forward and so couldn't have seen Sally falling into my arms. He must have been reacting to the sound of our voices and eavesdropping on our conversation. Meanwhile, Sally adjusted to our terrifying situation, looking ahead at the light and back towards the vortex. Her reaction was much the same as mine, as I saw her face contort with horror and confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, looking to me for answers. "That's what I'm trying to find out," I replied, before turning back towards the man in front. "Hey, buddy," I said. "You know our names. How about you tell us yours?" The man still refused to turn his head, and he didn't speak for a long time. But finally, he did answer my question, saying, "You can call me Milo." "Okay," I replied hesitantly. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't dwell on it. "Well, Milo, how about you tell us what the hell is going on?" I demanded. "What makes you think I know anything?" he replied cryptically. "I think you know more than you're letting on." I said, "You told me about the lines after all." Fair enough, Milo admitted. I know some things, but not everything. He paused before continuing. You wake up in this queue, standing between the white lines. You know what happens when you step outside of them. Sally didn't, not yet anyway. I was grateful she'd been spared the sight of the savage killing. What are those things out there? I asked, although a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Milo shrugged his shoulders, but still didn't turn around. Can't say for sure, he said. They could be demons, monsters, aliens, or genetic mutations. In the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? I know they dwell in the darkness all around us, and they see everything. For whatever reason, they can't step inside of the lines. We're safe from them as long as we stay in the queue. But if we enter their domain, they'll slaughter us without hesitation. I turned to Sally, seeing the fear in her eyes. That's a look I hadn't seen in a long time and hoped I would never witness again. I put a hand around my ex's shoulder to comfort her, but she pushed me away, and I was forced to remember why we'd broken up in the first place. I put this to the back of my mind, however, instead focusing on my inquisition of the faceless man in front. So, we're trapped here? I asked fearfully, the desperation now evident in my voice. Oh no. Milo answered in an almost flippant tone. I'm afraid you don't understand. The queue won't remain stationary. When the trumpets blow, we move forward, one at a time. When the trumpets blow. What the hell did that mean? I thought about it for a moment before I realized the implications of what Milo was saying. You mean we move towards the light? I asked hopefully. I knew little about our situation, but surely the white light at the top of the queue was our chance at salvation. Yeah, that's what happens. But there's a catch, Milo said. What do you mean? I demanded in angry frustration. You'll find out soon enough, was Milo's typically evasive response. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then I heard it. The trumpets, blaring from God knows where, a deafening and terrifying sound which blasted out from the darkness, seemingly surrounding us on all sides. Both Sally and I collapsed down to our knees, covering our ears with our hands in a futile effort to drown out the awful din. I felt the pressure building inside of my skull and thought my head was going to explode, but thankfully the trumpet stopped after a few moments, and then the line started to move. I looked forward and saw the figure at the front of the queue stepping into the light, his dark silhouette immersed as he raised his arms and cried out in glorious ecstasy, gladly allowing the portal to transport him to another realm. And with that, he was gone, freed from this nightmare and surely now safe from the monsters that dwelt within this dark hellscape. Wow, I expressed my amazement. But, as Milo had warned us, there was a catch. Suddenly we heard a blood-curdling scream from behind us, a cry of abject terror emitted by somebody in mortal danger. I swiftly turned my neck, seeing how Sally was already facing in that direction. My eyes widened in terror as I saw the man at the back of the line, his body being physically sucked into the swirling vortex of crimson red. He continued to scream as his legs were pulled inside, and soon he was up to his waist, reaching out desperately and digging his nails into the frozen dirt beneath him. Please, please help me, he cried. There was a woman ahead of him in the line, and, to her credit, she did try to help. Reaching down, she grabbed his hand tightly, but the pull of the hellish vortex was too great. Within minutes, she lost her grip upon him, and the man was sucked through the portal. I remember the look on his face the second before he disappeared into the abyss, his eyes so wide and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. And then he was gone. The middle-aged, slightly overweight woman who'd tried to save him suddenly cried out, as something inside of her just broke. I can't do this. I can't be here, she exclaimed. And before anybody got the chance to stop her, the frightened woman did the worst thing imaginable. She stepped over the white line. There was nothing we could do but watch as the poor woman attempted to run into the darkness. Inevitably, she didn't make it far, The attack didn't play out like the previous time. She wasn't set upon by a gang of savage monsters, but instead confronted by a single creature which suddenly emerged from the black abyss to block her path. The woman just froze, stopping dead in her tracks as she stared into the monster's burning red eyes. She was seemingly unable to flee or fight, as if the beast had her under its terrible spell. My jaw dropped as I observed the unreal scene. For a moment, I naively thought she might be okay, and that the monster would actually let her live. But then, in a single rapid and brutal action, the beast raised its muscular arm and thrashed out with its claw, easily cutting the woman's jugular wide open. She grabbed at her throat as blood poured from the gaping wound, and soon collapsed heavily to the floor. Her body continued to thrash as she choked on her own blood, but a moment later, and the beast leaned down and grabbed hold of her hair, dragging the slowly dying woman into the darkness. "Oh my God!" Sally cursed under her breath, and I couldn't utter a word. This was the second person I'd seen slaughtered by the monsters stalking the shadows. But it didn't get any easier. Frightened murmurs and the occasional scream went along the line as all present reacted to the horrors we'd just witnessed. Those who hadn't seen the deaths firsthand no doubt heard about them from their neighbors in the line, and the panic spread like wildfire. Still, I noted how Milo had not reacted at all to the bloodshed. Still, I reckoned he must have eyes on the back of his head, and perhaps he'd seen it all before. Nevertheless, our mysterious companion was able to provide an explanation of sorts. That's the catch I was telling you about. They let one person pass into the light whenever the trumpets sound, but there's a price to pay. One goes into the light, and the vortex takes one from the back of the line. That's the way it works. Suddenly I felt cold all over. I was sure the temperature had dropped since I first regained consciousness, although this was the least of my worries as my exhausted brain attempted to process what Milo had just told us. I'm sure Sally was doing the same, as she remained silent for the time being, although I could hear her clicking her tongue, a habit she did when nervous or stressed. I glanced ahead and behind me, once again confirming that we stood roughly in the middle of the long, single-file queue of people. If what Milo said was correct, one person would reach salvation at each trumpet blow, while one would simultaneously be sucked into oblivion, or whatever the hell lay on the far side of that damn portal. Assuming this twisted process continued, the line would gradually grow shorter as more people left this shadowland, and in the end, we too would discover our fate. I felt a vile sickness in the pit of my stomach as my whole body shook. I didn't know what to say next, but it was Sally who broke the silence. "Hey Milo, that's your name, right?" she shouted over my shoulder. I saw Milo nodding in confirmation, but he still wouldn't turn to face us. "You know, you still haven't answered Joshua's question. You didn't tell us where we are and why we're here." Milo snorted before replying. "Like I said, I don't know everything. But I guess I've been conscious to our situation for longer than the two of you. During that time, I've come up with a couple of theories." "Like what?" Sally demanded. I could tell she was becoming increasingly impatient. We'd been split up for 2 years at this point, and hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But seeing her again in this dangerous and terrifying situation made me realize I still had feelings for her. Milo eventually replied in a matter-of-fact tone, with no emotion evident in his voice as he spoke. "Well, one possibility is that we've been kidnapped or abducted by some malicious person or persons. What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" I tried to think, realizing there was an unexplained gap in my memory. "I remember driving," I said uncertainly, and then everything went black. This didn't make sense. Had I been in an accident? If so, why didn't I recall a crash or collision? I have the same memory," Sally muttered nervously. I glanced back at her in confusion, only to find she wouldn't meet my eye. This revelation confused me even more. Sally and I hadn't been together. We hadn't even seen each other in 2 years. What were the odds of us both being involved in car accidents at the exact same time? And all this talk reminded me of the incident which had led to our breakup in the first place. I'm sure Sally was thinking the same thing, but we'd both promised to never speak of that night again. So, if we were abducted, then who has us? Sally continued. And why are they doing this to us? That's the $1 million question, Milo replied. It could be aliens, I reckon. Or maybe it's the government running a psychological experiment, or some sick billionaire who tortures people for fun. But of course, there is another possibility, one which is more supernatural in origin. I stared at the back of Milo's head in astonishment, irritated that I couldn't see his face and tell whether he was serious or not. There was a tense pause while I waited for Milo to elaborate, but to my surprise, it was Sally who spoke up next. You mean that we're dead, she said ominously, that every person in the line is deceased and trapped between heaven and hell. Her chilling words hung in the air as we considered the terrifying inference. It's a possibility that's occurred to me, Milo responded dispassionately, breathing life into the horrific theory. So, if we really are dead, Sally continued, the white light means salvation while the whirlpool means eternal damnation. Milo didn't answer her question, but the conclusion Sally had come to seemed like an obvious one. Still, there was something that I just couldn't understand. But the people at the front of the line are guaranteed to reach salvation, while those at the rear will surely get sucked into hell, I exclaimed. Why are some saved and others doomed? I waited for an answer, but a moment later, and the trumpet sounded once again, forcing us to cover our ears and making further conversation impossible. And of course, the whole ritual played out again, as a solitary figure gladly walked into the light, while the poor sap at the rear was pulled into the whirlpool, screaming in abject horror as the vortex took him. The line had become slightly shorter, and it was now clear to everyone standing in the queue what was going on here. The fear in the icy cold air was palpable, and soon the line behind us descended into panic and chaos. I heard shouts and screams, looking back over my shoulder to see violent scuffles breaking out, as desperate souls tried to fight their way forward and put as much distance as possible between themselves and the vortex. The results were tragically inevitable. The white lines were only 3 feet apart at most. If people had been more cooperative, they could have slipped past one another and reorganized the line in a sensible manner. But nobody wanted to be left at the back of the queue when the dust settled, and so fights broke out. Desperate struggles that resulted in several people being thrown over the lines on either side. And of course, the monsters were there waiting. A dozen or more demons emerged from the shadows, roaring with fury as their red eyes burned with an intense hunger. The scene that followed was worse than anything we'd seen thus far, as ravenous monsters greedily tore into their near-helpless victims with claws and teeth. I couldn't bear to watch and so turned around, but I could still hear the screams and the awful sounds of ripping and tearing. Thankfully, the massacre soon ended. I guess that those at the back of the queue realized it was futile to try to fight their way forward, and so they stayed within the lines where the demons couldn't reach them. But suddenly, a horrifying thought crossed my mind, and I turned to speak with my ex-girlfriend. "Sally, who is standing behind you?" I asked in a panic. "It's okay," she replied. "There's a woman behind me, but she hasn't woken up yet. Her head's down and her eyes are closed." I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Sally was safe, for the time being at least. "What about you, Milo?" I said, addressing my question to the faceless man ahead of me. "Don't worry about me," he replied firmly. "I know how to look after myself." I had little doubt this was the case, and of course Milo was ahead of us in the queue. None of us said anything for a time, but once again our attention was drawn to the front of the line, where there was an unexpected and gut-wrenching development. We heard the sounds of an argument from the two people at the head of the queue, a man and a woman, by the sound of their voices. Their conversation was muted at first, but soon grew louder, enough so that we could hear from a couple of 100 yards away. I don't know whether the two knew each other outside of this hellscape, but they were having a heated discussion, with the man wanting to take action and the woman being against it. Finally, the man cried out in defiance, shouting, "Screw it! I'm not waiting a moment longer. I'm going through." With that, I saw the man charging towards the white light, determined to make it into the portal. But what happened next was horrific. The man didn't pass through a porous membrane like the others. Instead, he charged into a wall of flames, screaming in total agony as his skin and flesh burnt fiercely, and within seconds he was engulfed by the unholy inferno, his body reduced to mere ashes. The man's female companion yelled out in grief, and the rest of the line fell into a chilling silence. "We've all got to follow the rules," Milo muttered solemnly. "There are no shortcuts." For once I understood what he meant, and my jaw dropped when I considered what had just occurred. The man at the head of the line had suffered an agonizing, fiery death, and all because he was impatient. If only he'd waited until the trumpets blew, he would have safely crossed over to paradise. Slowly but surely, the line moved forward. We were now one step closer to salvation, but no one was likely to make the same mistake. Nevertheless, the situation continued to develop in an unexpected way. We heard muttered chatter from all along the line, dozens of separate conversations, but which surely related to the same topic, survival. And then something extraordinary occurred. People began to swap places in the queue voluntarily, carefully pushing past each other whilst ensuring that nobody stepped outside the lines. There weren't many changes to the prearranged order, but there were some, and these transfers were apparently done after mutual agreement and without the threat of violence. I was astonished, particularly when I saw the bald-headed man who now took the unenviable position at the very end of the line, but he did not seem afraid of his imminent damnation. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the cold ground, his form illuminated by the burning red of the vortex. I watched as he closed his eyes and remained perfectly still, as if in a deep meditation. I couldn't understand why at the time, but he seemed to have accepted this fate. And with that, the ominous trumpets blared, drowning out all other sounds as the now familiar cycle played out once again. I guess the woman at the top of the line had recovered from seeing her male companion burnt alive, because she slowly and carefully stepped into the light and safely passed through to the other side. And meanwhile, the bald-headed man at the rear maintained his monk-like composure right to the very end. He didn't fight or even scream when the vortex sucked him in, and his limp body disappeared into apparent oblivion. I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear that something significant was happening here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was and how it impacted on us. But Sally was quicker off the mark, which I suppose I should have expected. She'd always been smarter than me and knew how to cope in a crisis situation. I'd learned as much during the incident 2 years before. Still, as well as I thought I knew my ex-girlfriend, I never could have predicted what she'd do next. "Hey Milo, how are you holding up?" she said suddenly. I looked over my shoulder in confusion, only to see my ex giving me a knowing look. I'd seen that look before and knew what it meant. Sally wanted me to trust her and keep my mouth shut, and so this is what I did. I suspected she wanted Milo to turn around so she could make eye contact, but by now I knew this wouldn't happen. For whatever reason, our mysterious new friend was determined to keep his eyes facing forward. "I'm doing just fine," he answered, a response which struck me as odd. "Why do you ask?" Sally seemed frustrated by Milo's reply, but she persevered nonetheless. "Well, I feel like the three of us are in this together," she said, "but we know nothing about you, Milo. As you know, Josh and I were in a serious relationship. Things didn't work out, but we're still close, and we share custody of our son. I spun around in shock, opening my mouth to challenge my ex. But when I did so, she shot me a hard look and raised a finger up to her lips, silently telling me to stay quiet and go along with this. Obviously, Sally was lying. We never had a child together. We talked about it, but our relationship ended abruptly soon after the incident, and our dreams of having a family died at the same time. But now Sally was claiming we had a son together. I didn't understand why she'd made up this fictional child, but I soon found out. "You have a son?" Milo asked hesitantly. "Yes," Sally replied without delay. "His name's Kevin and he's 2 years old. A real rascal sometimes, but he's as sweet as punch." I was shocked by how deeply invested Sally was in this lie she'd manufactured from thin air. It was frightening how she was willing to add details to make it sound more convincing. I was driving to pick Kevin up from my parents' house when all this happened. I just hope he's not too upset and wondering where his mummy is. She let this sentence hang in the air for a moment, I guess for the maximum emotional impact. I couldn't bear to look at my ex-girlfriend and didn't wish to be part of her deception. And yet I couldn't bring myself to speak out against Sally, because I realized I still owed her a massive debt. Milo hadn't responded verbally to Sally's words, but she eventually followed up with a question. "Do you have children, Milo?" she asked purposefully. Milo's reply surprised me, because his usual cool demeanor broke down and he suddenly became upset and angry. "No," he spat. "I never had any kids. My wife and I wanted to, but we never got the chance." I think Sally was taken aback by his emotional response, but she soon regained her composure and continued with her ruse. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Milo," she said in what I knew was mock sympathy. "But we do have a baby boy, and in a situation like this, don't you think parents should get priority?" All of a sudden I got it. I guess I was slow to understand what my ex was doing, but Sally always said I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Milo was in front of both of us in the line, so he would reach the safety of the light before we did. We might survive either way, but Sally was hedging her bets, trying to get Milo to voluntarily switch places so a loving parent could survive and get home to her child. I guess this lie was meant to help me as well, but I still didn't like it. We'd told too many lies already, and there had to be consequences for our deception. Nevertheless, I didn't say a word, instead waiting for Milo's response. But before he had an opportunity to answer, the trumpet sounded once again. As we covered our ears, the familiar pattern took place before our eyes, with one figure stepping into the light and another getting sucked into the vortex. In the aftermath, an individual broke from the line and stepped into the shadowy kill zone. I was shocked to see this figure was little more than a child, an adolescent boy with wild terror in his eyes. I didn't see whether the kid was pushed or if he ran, but he was quick on his feet and seemed determined to make a break for it. Inevitably, a gang of 3 bloodthirsty demons emerged from the shadows and grasped out at the kid with their claws, but amazingly the kid dodged all of them, making it past the trio of monsters and sprinting into the darkness. He disappeared from sight, and for a brief moment I thought he could actually make it to safety, but then we heard a blood-curdling scream closely followed by the cracking of bones and the ominous sound of a huge beast biting into flesh, and I realized that the kid had fallen victim to some yet unseen horror looking in the shadows. My heart sank at that moment, but Sally's devious plan was still very much in play. Milo predictably didn't react to the kid's violent death, but he did recall the conversation we were having before the trumpets sounded. "So, you think you should go ahead of me because you have a kid?" he asked, his voice returning to his characteristic emotionless tone. I remained silent, but Sally spoke up on our behalf. "Frankly, yes. I don't want to be brutal about it, but we deserve the chance to see our boy again." But if we really are dead, then what difference does it make? Milo blurted out. I had to admit that he had a good point here. I didn't know how Sally would respond to this direct question which poked a massive hole in her story, but of course she had a pre-prepared argument. But we don't know that we're dead. Not for sure. If we have been abducted, then reaching the light could bring us home. And besides, even if we have passed away, don't you think two loving parents deserve to go to heaven? I didn't know how Milo would react to this loaded question, but I certainly didn't expect what happened next, because suddenly Milo began to laugh, quietly at first, but growing ever louder. But his laughter wasn't one of mirth. Instead, it was filled with bitterness and scorn. I turned around to look upon Sally, only to find she was as baffled as I was. We had no choice but to wait until Milo finished his mad cackling and opened his mouth to speak, his voice now filled with passionate anger. You really don't know who I am, do you? I hoped there would be some recognition, some remorse, but now I realize this is beyond you both. I shook my head in confusion, feeling like there was something I should have picked up on, but sadly I remained oblivious. I'm sorry, Milo, I don't understand, I said nervously. You don't, huh? Milo spat back. Well, maybe it's about time you saw my face. And with that, he slowly began to turn around for the first time. I stood there in nervous anticipation, my entire body trembling because I suspected what we'd see would not be pleasant. And when his face was illuminated, I recoiled in horror as my most painful memory came back to punch me in the gut. Milo's face was in actual fact a grotesque death mask, his dead eyes bulging and his forehead caked in dried blood. His skin looked like leather, and when he opened his crusty lips, green water poured from his mouth and nostrils. I heard Sally scream behind me, and I was about to follow suit. But, in that moment, the trumpet sounded, louder than ever this time. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands, but the almighty din was too intense. I felt like my head was about to explode, and then I found myself drifting out of consciousness, as suddenly my whole world went black. And then I was in another place and time, thrust back to a point in my life that I had tried my hardest to forget. Sally and I were in my car, driving along a lonely country road late at night. We were coming home from a party and were in high spirits. We'd both been drinking. I was driving and surely over the limit, but I'd made this journey a dozen times before and thought it would be fine. I remember the two of us laughing over a shared joke. I glanced over to the passenger seat, looking into Sally's mischievous eyes and feeling so much love for her at that moment. But I should have kept my eyes on the road because I didn't see the pedestrian until it was too late. A sudden panic overtook me as I slammed my foot on the brakes, but I hit the man head-on, horrified as his broken body was thrown up onto the hood before it smashed against the windscreen. I brought the car to a stop as the body fell heavily to the ground, and I sat frozen, still gripping a tight hold of the steering wheel and in a state of shock. Slowly, I turned to look at Sally and saw an expression of sheer horror etched across her face. "Joshua, what have you done?" she whispered, and I didn't have an answer. After some time, we exited the vehicle and went to see my victim. What we found was a bloody mess of a man, a human body broken almost beyond recognition. We were both sure he was dead. Sally and I stood there under the headlights on the side of the abandoned road, looking down at the corpse of the young man I'd just run over, and then I really started to panic. "Sally, what the fuck am I going to do?" I exclaimed. "I've killed a man. They'll send me to prison for this." "That's not going to happen," Sally answered firmly, her eyes narrowing as she took control of the situation. "There are no witnesses. Nobody saw what happened." She paused briefly, letting those words sink in. "The lake is only 5 miles from here. We can make him disappear." I glared at her in shock and disbelief, disgusted by the suggestion. But of course, I went along with her plan. I didn't wish to face the consequences of my actions, and so I conspired with my girlfriend to cover up the crime. With some difficulty, we lifted the body and loaded it into the trunk of my car. I vividly recall seeing the man's grotesque death mask, his dead eyes looking upwards into the night sky as we slammed the trunk shut and sealed him inside. We drove to the lake, exiting the car at the top of a disused jetty after releasing the handbrake, watching in solemn silence as the vehicle rolled downwards and disappeared under the water's surface. Sally and I made the long walk home that night, barely speaking a word as the seriousness of our crime hit home. We reported the car stolen the next morning, Sally giving the report to a disinterested police officer who didn't ask too many questions. A few days later, we heard a missing person report on the news, a young man who had been walking at night and never made it home. In the days and weeks that followed, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, forever fearing a knock on the door. But the cops never made the connection and didn't find the body. I guess it was about 2 months later when Sally and I were watching TV at home, and suddenly there was a press conference featuring a teary-eyed woman giving a statement with a photograph of the missing man framed behind her. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward and wept as she begged for her husband to come home. And the missing man's name was Milo. Suddenly my ears were filled with the sound of trumpets, and I was brought back to the dark hellscape, except the circumstances had changed during my absence. The first thing I noticed, before I even opened my eyes, was the overbearing heat. Before, this place had been ice cold, but now the opposite was true, and simultaneously my nostrils were filled with an awful stench of sulfur and burning flesh, making me retch in disgust. But when my eyes opened, I almost jumped out of my skin, and I started to stumble until a pair of arms grabbed me and held me up. "Remember the rules," was what she shouted in my ear, her voice just about audible over the almighty din. "Stay within the lines, and they can't get you." That was Sally, and she had a tight hold of me. I glanced into her wide eyes, wondering if she'd experienced the same gut-wrenching flashback I had during our blackout. The look of horror etched on her now drawn face told me she surely had. But this wasn't the reason she was so frightened. The demons weren't in the shadows any longer. They were standing right up beside us, so close that I could smell their foul breath which stank of rotting flesh, and see the flesh blood dripping from their sharp fangs. There were 6 of the beasts visible on either side of the white lines, appearing like soldiers standing to attention. They didn't make any attempt to attack, but the monsters shot us murderous glares through their burning red eyes, and they grind their razor-sharp teeth and click their long claws, as if eagerly anticipating the kills to come. But they couldn't get to us, not as long as we stayed in line. And the queue was much shorter now. I guess Sally and I had been out for longer than I'd thought, as we relived our past sins. Because, whereas the line had once included hundreds of lost souls, now there were only 5 of us. The doorway of white light was right in front of us, while the crimson vortex lay behind us, the 2 gateways competing to drown out the darkness. But the intolerable heat and disgusting stench came from our rear, and I had no doubt that the vortex was a portal to hell itself. In the moment which followed, the terrifying process repeated, as the anonymous figure at the front of the line crossed over, and the woman behind Sally screamed as the hellish whirlpool sucked her inside. And then there were only the 3 of us. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about Milo, but the ghoul was still facing us, his dead eyes burning with rage as he savored his moment of retribution. "Tell me," he snarled through his rotting maw, "do you 2 feel any guilt? Any remorse for what you did to me? For what you took from me?" I struggled to find the words to respond as I experienced a foul, burning sensation in the back of my head. I knew I couldn't hide from this any longer. "Milo," I spluttered. Of course, we're sorry for what happened, but it was an accident. You've got to believe that. Milo laughed bitterly once again. An accident, he exclaimed in anger. Was it an accident when you bundled me into your trunk and pushed your car into the lake? Was that a fucking accident? He paused briefly, his lifeless eyes narrowing. I was still alive when I went into the water. Did you know that? I shook my head in disbelief, muttering, "No, that's not possible." "It's true," Milo confirmed with a nod. "I slowly suffocated to death inside of that trunk, and they never found my body. My wife never got closure, never got to bring me home, and that's all because of the two of you." Milo was now beyond fury as he roared and charged toward Sally and I with his arms outstretched. "Josh, stop him," Sally screamed. But he was already upon me, his skeleton-like hands wrapping around my throat in an attempt to throttle me. I fought back with all my might, tackling Milo and shoving him to one side. And of course, he fell outside of the lines. Milo released his grip on my throat as the demons grabbed hold of him, their eyes lighting up with a ravenous hunger as they dug their claws into his flesh. Milo didn't fight or scream when they took him. He merely looked upon us with a sad resignation as they dragged him into the darkness. I glanced down at my own hands in disbelief, realizing that I'd killed this innocent man for the second time. The rest of the demons retreated at this point, cackling cruelly as they returned to the shadows. As I watched them go, I felt an immense guilt eating away at me, and I knew that it should have been me. It was Sally who broke me from my trance, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and forcing me to look her in the eye. "Joshua, are you doing okay?" she asked sympathetically. I shook my head, muttering, "I'm a killer." "You did what you had to do, Josh. You were trying to protect me, but I need your help one last time." "What do you mean?" I shot back in confusion. She sighed deeply, probably frustrated by my lack of awareness. "Come on, Josh. There's only two of us left now. What's going to happen when the trumpets sound?" And suddenly I was up to speed. I was standing in front of Sally in the line and was closest to the white light of salvation. "You want to swap places?" I said ominously. "You want me to sacrifice myself for you?" I wondered what I thought about this idea. It certainly wasn't an appealing offer. I was terrified by the vortex and whatever hell lay beyond it. Of course I was. But would I screw over the woman I'd once loved to save my own skin? It had never crossed my mind that it would come to this. But I think Sally had always envisaged this outcome. Sally had always been one step ahead. And in the end, she had the words to persuade me. My ex held my hand tighter, tears in her eyes as her tone became increasingly emotional. "I know it's a lot to ask, Josh, but remember, I saved you after the accident. You said you couldn't face prison and I made the problem go away. I don't deserve to suffer for your sins. You know that, Josh." I opened my mouth to respond, but we'd run out of time. The trumpets blared aloud, drowning out our conversation. I needed to make a decision right now, and I went with my heart over my head. In an instant, I grabbed hold of Sally's waist, embracing and kissing her once last time, before pushing her ahead of me in the line. The terrible din made any further words impossible, but in the last moment, Sally smiled back at me gently and mouthed, "Thank you." And as she did so, I remembered all the tenderness and love we'd once had for each other. But I couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that she'd played me. But Sally didn't wait, soon turning her back on me and confidently walking into the light. And then I felt the irresistible pull from behind me as the all-powerful vortex sucked me in. I felt my skin burning and the air leaving my lungs, and then I was gone from that place, never to return. I didn't know exactly what to expect once I regained consciousness and adjusted to my new environment. I knew it wasn't going to be a good place, but my panicked mind was filled with images of burning lakes of sulfur and sadistic demons wielding pitchforks. But the space I found myself in was quite unexpected. I was inside of a car, sitting in the driver's seat. But it wasn't just any vehicle. It was my car from 2 years previous. The same car I'd been driving on the night of the accident. The night I'd killed poor Milo for the first time. And that wasn't all. I was underwater, surrounded by dark flowing liquid on all sides, with the only illumination coming from the light above the dashboard. I started to panic, struggling to breathe as I desperately tried to open the doors, only to find they would not budge. Next, I kicked out at the windscreen, which was already shattered from the night of the accident. But when I kicked the glass, I discovered it was rock hard and unbreakable. I cried out in angry frustration, slamming my fists on the wheel and hearing the muffled sound of the horn. But then I was taken unawares by a chilling, deep voice from behind me, saying, "I won't bother if I were you. There's no way out." I jumped up and turned around, seeing a dark figure sitting in my back seat. I knew he hadn't been there a second before, and so he'd seemingly materialized out of thin air. The man, if that's what he was, appeared well-dressed in a finely tailored tuxedo suit, seamless white shirt, and black bow tie. But I couldn't see his face as it remained hidden in the shadows. Thus far, he'd only offered me what seemed like advice. Nevertheless, there was something very disturbing about his tone of voice and whole demeanor, and so I guessed this mysterious individual was no friend of mine. I felt like history was repeating itself and feared the worst, struggling to speak through trembling lips and asking, "What is this place?" "Isn't it obvious?" the shadowy figure replied. It was, of course, and I needed to face the grim reality of my situation. "I'm in hell, aren't I? This is my personal hell." The shadow man responded with a sly chuckle before saying, "Certainly not Joshua. This is a halfway house of sorts. Call it purgatory if you will. Believe me, you'd know if you were in hell." I experienced a wave of emotions in that moment, relief for sure, but, as always, I was confused. "I don't understand," I exclaimed. I was sucked into the vortex. I smelt the sulfur, felt my body burning. "You made an assumption," the man replied abruptly. "Did anyone tell you that one portal led to heaven and the other to hell?" I pondered his words for a moment until the horrifying implication became apparent. "Sally," I exclaimed. "What happened to Sally?" The man sighed before answering. "Sally is somewhere else. Don't worry about her now, Joshua. You won't see her again, not for a while anyway." I gulped, feeling a chill as I thought of my ex-girlfriend and feared for her safety. But it seemed there wasn't anything I could do for her right now. "And what about me?" I muttered nervously. "What will become of me?" There was a lengthy, almost unbearable pause before the shadow man answered me. "I'll be honest with you, Joshua. You've got us in a bit of a pickle. On one side, you committed a heinous sin on the mortal plane, but then you made a noble sacrifice in the Shadowlands to save a woman you once loved. Your sacrifice was futile in the end, but you weren't to know that. We're going to need some time to consider your fate, Joshua. In the meantime, you can stay here, in this watery prison of your own making." I experienced a renewed panic and also anger, crying out before I had the chance to think. "No, you can't keep me here. I won't stay." The shadow man's reaction was instant and furious. He leaned forward, allowing me to see his hideous eyes through the darkness, burning crimson orbs that reminded me of the vortex I'd been pulled into, mesmerizing and yet terrifying at the same time. And when he spoke, his voice blared out like a banshee's wail. "You'll do what we damn well tell you," he screamed. "Do not test me, you wretched mortal. I can make all your worst nightmares come to life." I'd never been as frightened as I was at that moment, not during my mortal existence, or even in the Shadowlands. Whatever this entity was, I realized he could inflict suffering upon me that I couldn't even imagine. I had no words to respond, and so I merely grabbed hold of the steering wheel and lowered my head in a meek submission. "Very well. the shadow man said with a smug satisfaction. Goodbye, Joshua. Until we meet again. I nervously glanced up into the rearview mirror and saw the entity melting away into the leather seat. And then I was alone. To this day I remain trapped in this watery grave, staring out at the bottom of the lake, which was the scene of my worst crime. I don't know how long I've been here. All I know is that I can't leave, not unless they set me free. I assume the Shadow Man will eventually return to reveal my ultimate fate. But for now, all I have is time. I've had what seems like an eternity to come to terms with what I've done. I think about Sally often, and Milo too. Will I ever see them again? I hope so, because when all my sins and regrets are washed away, all I want to do is make amends.